Chapter 328. What was Jianghu? It was a curtain of pearls. Women were those pearls, strung together to form Jianghu. The woman who had boarded the ship, whom Long Yuxuan had mistaken as a heroine, was undoubtedly the brightest pearl in Jianghu. There was almost no need for the suffix, one of. Although her appearance was only average, she was delicate and aloof. When she was young, she had traveled all over Beiliang with her family, drawing geographical maps. Later on, she entered Shangyin Academy and studied under Chancellor Dao Lin and the great master of the School of Military Strategy. She was famous for her poetry and literature, especially for the creation of 19 chessboards. She was the world's hegemon. Her chess style was calm and she could see strategies. Strangely enough, when she played chess, she rarely made a move that would make the spectators feel as if they had been struck by lightning. She was neither treacherous nor evil. Her moves were firm and steady. It seemed that she did not seek to make any achievements, but only sought to make no mistakes. Often, when she entered the middle chessboard, she would have a perfect winning spirit without any flaws. Judging a person based on calligraphy, she naturally could not be called a beauty. However, if one were to judge a person based on chess, she was undoubtedly an unparalleled existence in the world. On the chessboard, she convinced people with her reasoning. Outside of the chessboard, she had also made many moves to convince people with her strength. Her sword was not a gaudy ornament. She had cut off a head in Shangyin Academy. This was a feat that the previous Jixia scholar of Xie Lake, the spring and autumn demon Huang Longshi had never done. Today's literary circle had mixed praise for this young woman, but no one said that she was mediocre. But all of this was nothing. To the idiotic crown prince, he even dared to chase after Su Xiao with a broom. The reason why he was afraid of her on this trip was because he had a guilty conscience. If it was in the past, he would not be able to reason with his second sister, Su Weisheng. He would make a scene and annoy her. Most of the time, he would be able to muddle through. However, this time, he would most likely lose a layer of skin. Su Weisheng had treated him well and did not touch the art of war that could defeat 10,000 enemies. Instead, he did not learn how to maneuver in the imperial court. That boorish man was already very disgusted with him. In addition, when Su Fengnian took the risk of going to Martial Emperor City, he was even angrier. A gentleman would not stand against a collapsing wall. If he was not a gentleman, he should be even more so. Originally, he should go to Gangnam-do first to visit his eldest sister, Su Jihu, or go to Shangyin Academy to find his second sister. According to the itinerary, if he wanted to save time, he should go to Shangyin Academy, Mount Longhu, and Martial Emperor City, and then pass by Hutting County on the way back. However, it was because he was worried about his second sister's feelings that he took so many detours. As Su Jihu had said, he still had to consider whether his second sister would be petty about going to Gangnam-do first before going to the academy. The ship was only so big. How long would it take for His Royal Highness, who was like a fish waiting to be slaughtered on the chopping board, to hide? Su Fengnian didn't wait for Su Weisheng to enter the cabin to search. He squeezed out a smile and trotted out. Without saying anything, he hugged his second sister and didn't give her a chance to hit him with the scabbard. He called her sister in a flattering manner. However, he kept in mind that he should call her sister and not second sister. He said with a mischievous smile, "Why are you in the Zhenzhou? This place is a little far from the lifeless Shangyin Academy." Murong Xiong and Murong Xiong looked at each other. Even Murong Tonghuang, who was always shrewd and scheming, was dumbfounded by this scene. Su Weisheng, who was being hugged, didn't struggle. He said calmly, "I'm afraid that after you enter the Martial Emperor City, you will be cooked in a pot, including your skin and bones. Therefore, I have no choice but to wait here. This is a private matter. As for the public matter, it is a triennial examination of knowledge held by the Academy. The geomancy examination is set at the Earth Lung Mountain in the north of the Zhenzhou. It tests one's ability to look at the aura, locate the cave, and search for the dragon. Chancellor Wang has been drinking too much. Therefore, I will be acting as the examiner. Su Fengnian turned his head to look at the riverbank. Only then did he see a large group of scholars dressed like scholars standing there. The young ones had not yet reached the age of 20, while the old ones were already in their 60s. Most of them were carrying a heavy and bulky bookcase on their backs. Very few of them were wearing embroidered and magnificent clothes. However, it was exactly as the old saying goes, those who have a scholarly aura will naturally have a scholarly aura. Even Su Fengnian, an unscrupulous idiot who hated scholars the most, couldn't bring himself to dislike them. He wasn't the least bit surprised that his second sister was taking on the role of Mr. Ji Shang as a scholar. His second sister's knowledge was profound and varied. She had mastered the subject through a comprehensive study, and her words were brilliant. No matter if it was the orthodox classics, moral essays, or those misunderstood heterodox doctrines, or strange and ingenious obscenities, she was deeply involved in all of them. This was especially true for geomancy. She had once written annotated and corrected dragon scripture and carved jade axlewan two-song collection, which were exquisite to the smallest detail. Throughout the entire book, not a single word was deliberately obscure and difficult to understand. Because she liked to carry an ancient sword and travel the mountains and rivers, she was wholeheartedly convinced by the geomancy masters and was known as Su Qingshui or Mr. Qingwu. Su Fengnian released his hand and took a step back. He stared blankly at his travel-worn second sister. For a long time, he didn't say anything. He just helped her to tuck a strand of black hair behind her ear. Chapter 329. In the Su family, she was the most elegant general among all the children of the Su family. However, Su Weisheng was even more famous for his stubbornness. There was once a famous literary scholar who wrote a famous poem that was handed down from generation to generation. In the poem, there was a famous line, regardless of the details, regardless of the propriety, 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 the propriety, regardless of 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 the propriety, Su Weisheng was kind and didn't exaggerate. He only wrote 3 sentences in his reply: if a man doesn't keep his word, why not die? His words and actions contradicted each other. What an old thief. teaching books to mislead the students. The old man was so angry that he vomited blood and fell seriously ill. Only then did the truth of the chess gambling incident at the academy come to light. The literary community naturally criticized this woman for being unreasonable. As for the chess players of the world, they suddenly realized that Su Weisheng would never lose if he played black. Although the position system limited the advantage of playing white first, it was simply a miracle that Su Weisheng, who had played more than 100 games and competed with the great chess players of that time, could still play black and not lose. These were important matters, and Su Fengnian also knew some trivial matters. Second sister was obsessed with cleanliness, and everything in the boudoir was meticulously arranged, almost to the point of being rigid. The vase, the brush, the inkstone, the chair, the couch, the stove, the book, and so on, had not changed in the slightest for more than 10 years. When he was young, the naughty Su Fengnian's favorite thing to do was to sneak into second sister's room and quietly move some small things that couldn't be seen. Without exception, Su Weisheng would always find some clues, and then find Su Fengnian and pinch his ears to death. Relying on his coarse skin and thick flesh, Su Fengnian never got tired of playing for many years. In his impression, Su Weisheng's clothes were simple and plain, but they were very clean. It was never as eye-catching as it was today, and it could be seen that she had left in a hurry. In the end, this warm and tender scene of a sister and brother meeting was ruined by a lustful little wimpy kid. "Miss, hug." Su Weisheng lowered her head to look. It was a child with lively eyebrows. She only glanced at it, and before she even opened her mouth to speak, the little bug shrunk its neck. Perhaps it was this child's ability to observe people's expressions since it was in its mother's womb. It immediately ran away, hiding behind Sister Yu, who was holding the white cat, and poking its little head out to peep. Wu Meinyang was intimate with him, jumping out of the gentle tomb of the world's heroes between Yu Yu's twin peaks. In the end, she was slapped to the ground by the child, who was in a bad mood. Wu Meinyang didn't get angry. She used her head to rub the child's trousers, making His Royal Highness, who had raised it until it was white and fat but refused to even hug it, furious. This was the first time Su Weisheng had seen the old god of swords, Li Chungang. The old man in the sheepskin coat was yawning, his spirit dispirited and listless. He didn't have the slightest respect for her because she was the princess of Beiliang or Su Qingchong. Su Weisheng, however, bowed respectfully and said, "Su Weisheng greets Sir Li." "Sir, the words soared from the great snow plains are so loud that even the deaf can hear." "Sir, everyone, and heir apparent." These 3 words had become a disaster after the spring and autumn period was settled. They were like a flood that couldn't be stopped. Any Tom, Dick, or Harry on the roadside could put a big hat on his head while flattering each other. However, when it came from Su Weisheng's mouth, the weight couldn't be more solid. In the Shengyin Academy, which was regarded as a holy land by scholars all over the world, even the 2 teachers and the Grand Chancellor didn't have the fortune to be called Sir by her. Only a nameless and blind zither player could be called Sir by her. Obviously, Su Weisheng was so serious about this matter because he admired the old god of swords from the bottom of his heart. It wasn't because of Li Chuangong's achievement as a sword immortal, but because of his great perseverance after falling out of the earth immortal realm to enter this realm. If he was only a sword immortal, compared to Su Weisheng, he was just a boorish swordsman with sharper sword in his hand and more capable of killing people. What benefit did he have to the world? The old man sized up Su Weisheng and shook his head. "Your aptitude is not as good as little Zhang's." Su Weisheng said calmly, "I practice the sword only to strengthen my body." Li Chungang lectured him without holding back, "What a pity for such a good sword. In your hands, it won't be able to sing to its heart's content." Su Weisheng smiled and said, "I only know some swordsmanship, which can't be compared to Mr. Li's swordsmanship. If Mr. Li lacks a suitable weapon during your trip to Martial Emperor City, Su Weisheng can give this sword to Mr. Li." Su Fengnian said angrily, "No way." Su Weisheng frowned. Su Fengnian immediately smiled and said, I don't lack swords here. Li Chungang didn't even want to bother with his royal highness. He said to the decisive Su Weisheng, the sword is a good one, but I know that you have a deep understanding of swordsmanship. Saying that you only know swordsmanship is too modest. A gentleman fulfills another's wish, while a villain snatches another's. This old man is neither a virtuous gentleman nor a vile person who can't bear to see others doing well. I won't give them away or rob them. Moreover, whether there is a sword or not, it doesn't matter to this old man anymore. Su Weisheng, you don't have to test this old man. Since this old man has promised Su Shao that this kid can return to Beiliang without missing an arm or a leg, whether it's the Eastern Sea or the capital city, as long as this kid dares to go, this old man can guarantee that he can leave alive. Su Weisheng never bowed like a woman. Instead, he bowed like a man and said softly, Thank you, Mr. Li, for your promise. Li Chungang had a helpless expression. He clicked his tongue and said, I heard that the Jiang girl was bullied by you and wanted to get back some face for her after meeting you. Now that you've bowed twice, this old man really doesn't have the face to make a move. Su Weisheng smiled calmly. His words were truly shocking. He said slowly, To tell you the truth, since ancient times, mother-in-law and sister-in-law have been at odds with each other. It doesn't mean that those mother-in-law and sister-in-law are all bad people. They just want to make the women who marry into the family think more about their husbands. Su Weisheng has always treated Jiang Ni as his younger sister-in-law. It's just that she has a lively personality and our mother passed away early, so I have to be the bad guy. However, Su Weisheng knew that Chao Chongqing took Jiang Ni away. If he had known earlier, he wouldn't have been the bad guy all those years. The tranquility was like a sudden clap of thunder. Li Chungang was stunned. He gave a thumbs up and praised, Su Shao is more fortunate to have you than to have this rascal. This chapter was updated on the 22nd. Chapter 330. Su Weisheng was not surprised by Li Chunggang's praise. He looked at Su Fengnian and asked, Is there food on the ship? In order to stop you on the way, I was in a bit of a hurry and missed lunch. You owe those people a meal. Su Fengnian nodded and said, That's not a problem. There are many freshly caught freshwater fish stored on the ship. As soon as he finished speaking, Blue Bird went to instruct the cooks to get to work. Su Weisheng turned to disembark the ship and brought the 20 or so scholars of Jixia onto the deck. These scholars of different ages seemed to be somewhat reserved. Only a few military students took the initiative to come forward and greet His Royal Highness. Only Shangyin Academy was bitterly holding on, sheltering the poor scholars of the world and preserving the seeds of education for the future generations. Unfortunately, the academy was a private school. In terms of financial resources, it was far from being as extravagant as the Imperial College, which was endowed with gifts from the emperor and ministers. During the spring and autumn period, the academy was funded by the rich and powerful families. Now, all of the vermilion gates and high walls had become broken walls and dilapidated walls. It was increasingly poor and in dire straits. As a result, other than the military students who studied the wars of the past dynasties, most of the scholars of Jishang and Jixia had a natural dislike for the Su family of Beiliang. During lunch, Su Fengnian and his second sister, Su Weisheng, purposely avoided the crowd and opened a small meal. Su Fengnian wolfed down his food while Su Weisheng chewed slowly. The two personalities were completely different. Su Fengnian knew that she did not like to talk while eating, so he minded his own business and opened the bookcase. He saw a few bags of soil and reached out to pinch them. He sniffed them and frowned. He carefully put them into his mouth and tasted them. He asked in shock, this dragon sand was dug out from that Taoist paradise, Earth Lung Mountain. It's true that it's dragon sand, but the taste is not quite the same as what Brother Yao Jian said. Why do I feel like there's something wrong with it? His Royal Highness often went to the Bailiang Mountains with his second sister and dragon scholar Yao Jian to search for dragon acupoints during his youth, so he knew a little about feng shui. Even though Su Fengnian did not have the ability to search for dragon acupoints in 3 years, he was still able to recognize the basic pattern of dragon veins. Digging dragon sand was actually the same as digging winter bamboo shoots. It was a test of experience and knack. Su Weisheng was a master in this field, so Su Fengnian could only stumble upon it by accident. However, he still had a good eye for the quality of the dragon sand he obtained. There were 6 or 7 bags of dragon sand in the box, most of which had already been burned. Su Fengnian picked up the bag that he tasted and sealed it with 3 yellow talisman characters, 3 pure ones rule, 8 ice plum blossom, and Chuyun's saddle horse. There was no doubt that it came from his second sister, Su Weisheng. This was because the seal books were very particular. The rules of the talisman had to match the birth date of the unearthed dragon sand. Furthermore, the unearthed dragon sand was not a small matter. Regardless of whether it was a Taoist dragon scholar or a green bag master, none of them were allowed to take dragon sand. This was especially so after the unification of the country. The imperial court had ordered that any dragon sand unearthed must be approved by the Chongxian Bureau and the imperial astronomer. However, in the past 20 years, there had not been a single case of approval. Su Weisheng's actions were undoubtedly against the imperial court's laws. However, Su Fengnian was too lazy to pay attention to such details. He was just curious about how the Earth-Lung Mountain had been the top of the heavenly abode since ancient times, so how could an evil dragon appear? One had to know that in the ranking of the Grotto Heavens and Blessed Lands, even the Dao Court's Mount Longhu was several ranks lower than the Earth-Lung Mountain. However, for hundreds of years, the Earth-Lung Mountain had always been an ungoverned land where no great Daoist master cultivated. Counting with one's fingers, it had already been 500 years since the previous dynasty sealed off the mountain. Su Weisheng put down his chopsticks and sighed softly. The examination of Jixia scholars' qi-gazing technique this time was just a cover. The evil dragon has recently appeared in the Earth-Lung Mountain, and Chancellor Wang deduced that it has something to do with Mount Longhu, which is of the same lineage as the Earth-Lung Mountain. It was only suppressed by Heavenly Master Zhao Danping that the imperial astronomer didn't make things difficult for the imperial court. Su Fengnian's expression changed when he heard that. He gritted his teeth and said, "It must be that Zhao Huangchao's evil method of stealing the sky and swapping the sun. Sister, if it's really as I guessed, the imperial astronomer wouldn't dare to interfere at all." Su Weisheng had a face of doubt. Su Fengnian smiled and stood up. Come. Sister, let me help you wash your hair. We'll talk while we wash." Su Weisheng did not refuse. Su Fengnian had the green bird outside the door bring in a basin of hot water and a piece of jade pancreas. Poor families used to wash their hair with cheap and coarse honey locust, but rich families were much more particular. Inside the pancreas was ground pearl powder, so it was called jade pancreas. Su Fengnian held his second sister's soft black hair. His eyes were warm, and with a soft voice he said, "One night on Mount Quanglu, I felt like I was dreaming but not dreaming. I saw Nyangqin. Nyangqin came with a white python to protect me, this disappointing son." Zhao Huangchao, who looked like a middle-aged Daoist, said that he was cultivating at Mount Longhu, but he was most likely the old ancestor in the capital. He rode on a black dragon and went on a spiritual journey. His ostentation was lawless, and he said that he was going to enforce justice on behalf of the heavens. Coincidentally, a scholar named Xianyuan Jingqing entered the realm of Confucian Saint a few days ago. I asked the old god of swords about the rules of celestial beings in a roundabout way. I knew that the immortal Daoist Shinran of Taoism condensed their own fate and couldn't easily interfere with the operation of the mortal world. Zhao Huangchao's move more or less didn't conform to the principles of Taoism. This Daoist must have transferred the after-effects of celestial beings' out-of-body state to the ownerless Earth-Lung Mountain. Otherwise, it would be tantamount to forming a grudge with the Taoist mansion of Mount Longhu. I don't understand. Our Bailiang obviously won't be so free to rebel. What's this Xiao Huangchao worried about? Su Weisheng said calmly, of course, he's worried that the Zhao family won't be able to stabilize their country forever. Su Fengnian sneered and said, which dynasty can be passed down for thousands of generations? They keep saying long live the emperor and long live the empress, but who can really live for thousands of years? Eating carrots and worrying about salty things. Su Fengnian said gloomily, with this Daoist Shenren's realm, if he doesn't ascend, wouldn't he be standing in a latrine pit and not taking a shit? It's only on Mount Longhu. If we were in Bailiang, we'd have to mobilize 10,000 cavalrymen to crush this old bastard into powder. Su Weisheng tilted his head and the corner of his mouth curled up. He turned a blind eye and laughed, yawning toad, you sure talk big. Let's not talk about whether a celestial being Daoist can be killed. Let's talk about whether you can command 10,000 cavalrymen now. Let's not talk about 10,000, even 1,000, can you do it? Chapter 331. After washing her hair, Su Fengnian wiped Su Weisheng's hair with a towel. They sat down. His Royal Highness helped Su Weisheng comb her hair. He was proud of his second sister's sarcasm. He laughed, borrowing troops from heroes like Qin Jibao and Dian Xiong is asking for trouble. But there's still Fatty Chu. If there's no other way, we can borrow from Yuan Zuozong and Brother Yao. Su Weisheng asked with a faint smile, are you sure that Yuan Zuozong and Yao Jian will lend you? Aren't you afraid of Su Zhao's military punishment? You have to know that in northern Liang, regardless of whether you are close or distant, as long as you violate the military rules, you have to act according to the law. Su Fengnian was still not serious, Brother Yao is stubborn, so it's hard to say. But if it's Yuan Zuozong, if there's an emergency, I may be able to borrow 1,000 or 2,000 troops. Su Weisheng asked, are you sure? Su Fengnian nodded, I'm sure. Su Weisheng took the red sandalwood comb and chuckled, you just drank with Yuan Zuozong a few times. Do you think your friendship is so good? You should know that Yuan Zuozong can't tolerate sand in his eyes the most. He and Chu Lushan are both Su Zhao's adopted sons, but they are like fire and water. It can be seen that you, a foppish son, are confident you can enter Yuan Baixiong's eyes. Su Fengnian curled his lips, it's up to you to believe it or not. Su Weisheng said sarcastically, it's disappointing that you didn't fight in Dragon Tiger Mountain. Su Fengnian shook his head and said, the commotion is not small. Oh right, that Xianyuan Jingqing, who relied on reading books to become a land immortal, has some cultivation experience. It's not very useful to me at the moment. It's the same as not reading it. Xianyuan Jingqing attracted countless heavenly thunders on the Great Snow Plateau. That scene was not inferior to that of a general leading thousands of cavalry. Along the way, I've checked many Taoist Qi refinement scriptures, but I feel that none of them are as down-to-earth as this moral forbidding thunder incantation. The Defingdu ghost punishing incantation, and the Abyss divine incantation scripture, of the Dragon Tiger Mountain's 24-level incantation scriptures seem to be more mystical and not very practical. I've studied it for half a month, but I still can't figure out how to cast the landslide spell and the water boil spell. This forbidding thunder incantation, however, seems to be according to the book's records. If you cultivate it to the extreme, you can borrow the power of the heavens just like Xianyuan Jingqing. It's a pity that I'm practicing the saber, so I'm not on this path. By the way, when I was studying the red armor talisman with the old celestial master Zhao Shituan at Dragon Tiger Mountain, I checked it out. The Qi cultivation incantation seems to have originated from the ancient barbarian land where Shangyin Academy is located. Maybe there's a unique ancient book in the academy that you need. Also, according to the Forbidden Thunder spell, I helped you steal a few Thunder Sect secret scrolls from Dragon Tiger Mountain. There are probably some incantations to guide the Thunder Sect's divine warriors. According to the old Celestial Master, the ascended Celestial Masters of Dragon Tiger Mountain would leave their essence incantations in the Dragon Lake. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to steal these treasures for you. Also, that female tiger Kuei nicknamed Bodhisattva, the one called King Kong, I've already given it to Huang Manor. Bodhisattva will give it to you. His Royal Highness rambled on endlessly. Su Weisheng interrupted Su Fengnian's rambling and said with a smile, "You've given me all the good stuff. What about yourself?" Su Fengnian was stunned for a moment. He smiled and pointed at the two sabers at his waist. He said matter-of-factly, "What use do I have for those worldly possessions? The spring thunder embroidered winter is enough." Su Fengnian saw that his second sister was silent. He knew that she didn't like him practicing the saber and being a brute warrior. He changed the topic and asked, "Today, I saw the famous Jixia scholar of Shangyin Academy with my own eyes. Only then did I know that there are a lot of poor people." Su Weisheng smiled and said, "Scholars carry books and travel to study, and wanderers carry their swords and travel. These are the two main trends nowadays. The former started when this old man Zhang traveled to various countries. It's just that it's hard for those poor landowning households that have already declined. For the sake of face, they still pay attention to carrying books and traveling after their heirs reach the age of 20. For this reason, they don't hesitate to scrape together money. Think about it, when a weak scholar travels, it's at least a few hundred li away. They have to have a page to take care of their basic necessities, as well as an old servant who's familiar with the ways of the world. Won't the small families rack their brains over the expenses of these three people? Therefore, some landowning households that have long been no different from the poor families don't dare to dream of traveling thousands of li when they carry books and travel to study. At most, they just visit a few counties in a state and try their best to visit a few famous scholars and experts. They drink tea and discuss Taoism with them. That's all. The families of many scholars don't hesitate to squander their family fortune in order to enter Shangyin Academy. On this trip to Earth Lung Mountain, there was a Jixia scholar in the group who stayed outside the academy for 18 years before passing the examination. He's already over 50 years old. Most of the Jixia scholars who teach him are younger than him. In order to save money to buy more books, he only eats steamed buns and salted vegetables all year round. Therefore, Shangyin Academy isn't as useless as you originally thought. Those who can enter Shangyin Academy, regardless of morality, are not bad. Su Weisheng stretched out his hands and pinched Su Fengnian's cheeks. He smiled and said, "It seems that you've benefited a lot from these two trips. I'm wondering if I should persuade you to go to Beimang again." Su Fengnian said sluggishly, "Sister, do you really think so?" Su Weisheng increased his strength and said, "Since I can't stop you from practicing the knife, and it seems that your knife practice is not just about developing your limbs, it's not right for me to stop you. But let me say this first. Since you want to practice the knife, you should at least practice until you become a land immortal, right? It's been hundreds of years since anyone has done this." Su Fengnian's face was bitter. He said vaguely, "Sister, why don't you practice the sword until you become a sword immortal?" Su Weisheng let go of his hand and smiled with squinted eyes, "Sister, you're a woman. Fighting and killing is not ladylike." Su Fengnian said helplessly, "Sister, you're so reasonable." Su Weisheng stood up and said, "Let's go. Since I've decided not to stop you from practicing the knife, I won't stop you from going to Martial Emperor City. You just have to be careful." Su Fengnian and his second sister walked out of the cabin together. Coincidentally, there was a poor old scholar leaning against the railing and looking at the river nearby. He muttered to himself, "Even a homeless dog like me has homesickness." Chapter 332. His Highness the Crown Prince happened to hear the old student talking to himself, but he ignored him. There were countless people in the 8 kingdoms during the spring and autumn period. Which one of them was not a stray dog? When he brushed past the scholar who was mocking himself as an old dog, he saw from the corner of his eye that the old man was clearly in a hurry. Seeing that His Royal Highness had no intention of stopping, he hurriedly turned around and made a deep posture as if he was looking at the river. He was very worried about the country and the people. He continued, "Before the Zhenyuan period of my dynasty, the struggle in the imperial court was a struggle between the pillars of the country. It was a struggle between the civil and military officials who had helped the late emperor build the country. Each of them represented the forces behind them and schemed against each other. They fought for benefits. Among them, the orphans of the 8 kingdoms were lucky enough to occupy a seat. Starting from the Yonghui period, Grand Secretary Zhang Julu began to hold power. After more than 10 years of the Yonghui period, the talents of the 8 kingdoms, either voluntarily or by force, gradually abandoned the fence and integrated into the imperial court. The boundary between civil and military officials was blurred. It turned into a confrontation between the north and the south. The south was relatively weak, but it had the support of the 2 kings of Yan and Guangling. Especially in the short 4 years from the first year of the Yonghui period to the 4th year of the Yonghui period, led by the Minister of Personnel, Xiao Yuling, who was born of a concubine, from the south, Wang Xiongui, Yuan Gua, Han Lin, and the others from the Han family in the south were promoted one after another and were able to hold real power in their respective departments. They complemented each other with the Jiangnan scholar group and their power soared. They spared no effort to fight for one word, fame. However, the struggle for fame and fortune between civil and military officials was only on the surface. In the end, it could not escape the emperor's technique of balance. Looking at the past 20 years, the people in the imperial court all had their own achievements. Only the isolated great general Su of Beiliang was exempt. His value was that he was far away from the struggle in the imperial court. Not fighting was the biggest fight, and it was really powerful. I, Lu Wenbao, am different from those scholars. When I look at the rise and fall of the dynasty, I do not rely on the wisdom and muddle-headedness of the emperors. Instead, I find another way. I start from the power of the ministers. Virtuous ministers prosper the country, evil ministers harm the country. I, Lu Wenbao, secretly think that in less than 5 years, the first person in this dynasty, Zhang Julu, will. Lu Wenbao, who had a long and eloquent speech, had just reached the most important part. He originally wanted to keep the audience in suspense and catch their appetite so that he could say something surprising. However, when he turned his head slightly, he was stunned as if a large basin of cold water had been poured over his head. His Royal Highness had already disappeared. This impromptu but carefully planned self-recommendation was in vain. Lu Wenbao, who had lost his home, sighed and could not help but feel disheartened. He was born in a declining aristocratic family in the old southern Tang. As Su Weisheng said, he was a poor scholar who could not even leave a single county. When he was young, he always thought about his mother, who said that before he was born, his palm was bitten by a leopard in his dream. Therefore, he was named Wenbao. When he was young, he was determined to be a marquis or a minister. However, at that time, before the fall of the southern Tang, only family name was important. Lu Wenbao was very conceited when he was young, so he went to the Shangyin Academy to study. He wanted to amaze the world with a single brilliant feat. However, he did not know how difficult it was to enter the academy. How could he have the face to return home? He swore that he would not return home until he was rich. Unexpectedly, in the blink of an eye, he was an old man in his 50s. Glory, splendor, and wealth were still out of his reach. Some of the talented students in the academy were almost old enough to be Lu Wenbao's grandsons. Old man Lu's ambition in his early years was like the river in front of him, flowing slowly with time and never returning to the East Sea. However, today he met the Crown Prince of Beiliang. He originally hoped that wealth and honor could be found in danger. However, His Royal Highness was not interested in listening to this old student's nagging. This was reasonable. With His Royal Highness's aristocratic family background, if someone sold their talent to him, it would be more than a few hundred to £1,000. I, Lu Wenbao, am a nobody. What am I? The wind on the river was not biting cold. Lu Wenbao stretched out his hand and rubbed his wrinkled skin that was like a withered tree. He muttered absent-mindedly, "It's time to go home and take a look. Even if I have to beg along the way, I have to die in my hometown and return to my roots." Su Weisheng saw Su Fengnian's footsteps leave without stopping. When he reached the bow of the boat, he laughed softly and asked, "Aren't you curious if this old scholar really has some valuable military strategy in his stomach?" Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Didn't this old man say that he was homesick? If I take a liking to him, I can take him to Beiliang. How long will it take for him to return home?" Su Weisheng sighed and said, "Lu Wenbao's hometown has changed a long time ago. His family has mostly withered. His father, mother, wife, and children have all died in war and disease. Even if he goes back, no one will remember him, an old man who has left home for 30 years. Su Fengnian frowned and asked, "This old man has real talent?" Su Weisheng said indifferently, "The Jisheng teachers in the academy all think that Lu Wenbao is not a master of miscellaneous knowledge. They don't think highly of him." Su Fengnian asked directly, "I don't care what others think of me. Sister, just tell me what you think of this old man. If you think he is useful, I will let him go to Beiliang to make a living. At the very least, he can get a lucrative position as a low-ranking official. It's better than being bullied in the Shangyin Academy. He is not young anymore. Judging from his attentiveness just now, it is obvious that he has read a lot and is smart. I believe that he doesn't care about his reputation." Su Weisheng smiled and said, "Actually, I don't think highly of Lu Wenbao either." Su Fengnian rolled his eyes and said, "What's going on? Then let him stay in the Shangyin Academy. I don't have the ambition to conquer the world, nor do I have the pretentious attitude of paying respects to the wise. An old scholar who has been in the Shangyin Academy for so many years has not made a name for himself. If he goes to Beiliang, it will be a waste of resources. If he gets into trouble, he might get his head chopped off by the ruffians. Why bother?" Su Weisheng shook his head and said, "But what Lu Wenbao said just now was quite interesting." Su Fengnian sneered and said, "Even an ignorant and incompetent person like me can tell that he is talking big. He is talking about Zhang Julu, Zhao Yuling, or the Grand Secretary, the Emperor, and the Prime Minister. He is so high that he can't be higher than this river. What's the point of talking about all this?" Su Weisheng, who had been walking behind him, blinked and said, "What's interesting is that Lu Wenbao hasn't had the time to add the finishing touch. Unfortunately, you left too quickly. Otherwise, he would most likely say that His Majesty wants to cultivate a confidant who can compete with Zhang Julu in all aspects in the next few years. In fact, as Lu Wenbao has guessed, it is not far from the truth. Do you know that there are 2 new clerks in the Minxia province who are in charge of recording and supervising the Emperor's words and actions? Their identities are just as Lu Wenbao said, the battle between the North and the South. One of them is from the Wei household, a leading aristocratic family in the North. The other's ancestors are from the Eastern Wuhan tribe. They have always been unknown and only know that they are studying in the Northern St. Zhang family. But according to reliable sources, the clerks who are in their 30s are highly regarded and trusted by the Emperor. If we talk about the path of the bureaucracy, it is very likely that they are the same as Zhang Julu's. After a few more years of hard work, perhaps this person will have the opportunity to make waves with one turn of the hand. It should be known that this secret is something that even many of the important officials in the imperial court cannot see through. But Lu Wenbao, a scholar who is far away from the imperial court, can use history books to determine the future. It is not easy. If you don't believe me, you can call Lu Wenbao over and ask him." Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, "Don't. Second sister, you have a divine foresight. When we were young, I never won a bet against you." Su Weisheng smiled with narrowed eyes. Su Fengnian immediately corrected her without any backbone, "Sister. Unexpectedly, Su Weisheng said softly, "In the future, just call me second sister. Don't fight with her over this." Su Fengnian did not dare to harp on this issue and stopped while he was ahead. He asked in a low voice, "Since the old man has some ability, how should we deal with him? Throw him to Beiliang." Su Weisheng thought for a moment and said, "There's no rush. Wait until you return from Beimang before making a decision. If you personally try to rope him in with just a few words, then Lu Wenbao's temperament, which has been tempered for decades, will climb up to his head again. With your impatient temperament, you won't have the good temper to temper anyone." Su Fengnian said with an aggrieved expression, "Sister, these words are too unreasonable." Su Weisheng changed the topic and looked directly at Su Fengnian. "I want someone from you." Su Fengnian was slightly stunned and said, "Say it." Su Weisheng smiled playfully, "Yu Xuanji." Su Fengnian frowned. "Yu You's father is a famous scholar from Shangyin Academy, but what use do you have for his daughter?" Su Weisheng was as rude and unreasonable as usual, "You're not giving." Su Fengnian smiled shyly and said, "Can I lend it to you? Remember to return it to me." Su Weisheng said without hesitation, "Of course I'm lending it to you. Otherwise, what use do I have for a girl from you? If she's just a courtesan, Yu Wei, it's a waste of talent." Su Fengnian was puzzled. The country is already ruined. Even if it's Yu Xuanji, what can he do in Shangyin Academy? Su Weisheng went straight to the point. "If you want to catch a 1,000-year-old tortoise, you have to put in some effort into the bait." Su Fengnian was full of doubts and curiosity. He couldn't help but ask, "Sister, tell me more about it." Su Weisheng shook his head and smiled without saying a word. Su Fengnian immediately pulled on Su Weisheng's sleeve and acted shamelessly. Probably because she couldn't win against His Royal Highness' childishness, Su Weisheng said something strange, "I've always wanted to play a game of chess with an old senior. It's time to play." Su Fengnian didn't ask any more questions. He knew that no matter how reluctant he was, she would have to leave eventually. He said helplessly, "Sister, why don't I go to the academy to visit you after I go to the East Sea Martial Emperor City?" Su Weisheng said flatly, "No." Su Fengnian was about to say something, but she had already made it clear, there's no room for discussion. Su Fengnian let out a long breath and said softly, "Then you can take this boat. It's more comfortable to travel by water than by land. It'll save you a lot of trouble." "I don't need it anyway." Su Weisheng didn't hesitate and nodded. Chapter 333. Su Fengnian went to look for Yu Yue. From the beginning to the end, from the beginning of their conversation to the parting of ways, the plump beauty holding the white cat did not speak to His Royal Highness at all. Su Fengnian went ashore and mounted the handsome white horse. Looking back, he saw her and Wu Meinyang, who had gained an unknown amount of weight. Su Fengnian sighed quietly. He could not see the slightest bit of joy or sorrow in her eyes. After this parting, they would not be able to meet again for at least a few years. If his second sister, Su Weisheng, did not say anything, Su Fengnian would not have allowed her to stay at Shangyin Academy. It seemed that her parents were buried there. When His Royal Highness returned to Beiliang after 3 years of traveling, if he had been a few days later, she seemed to have said that she would go to the academy to guard her parents' graves and would not set foot in Jianghu again. Su Fengnian sat on the horse and gently pulled on the reins. He turned the horse around and rode slowly along the road. He remembered that when he was still a dandy among dandy, he had a conversation with Yu Huakue, who was not Yu Xuanji. She had said that the word sorrow should be explained by the autumn in the heart of parting people. Su Fengnian looked up at the sky and muttered, "It's really a good time to be filled with bullshit homesickness and sorrow." On the shore, the little bug who was still lustful shouted toward the big ship, Sister Yu, when I grow up, I'll marry you. It's a promise." The corner of Long Yuxuan's mouth twitched. He grabbed the little kid by the collar and pulled him back. Then he leaped onto a horse and rode together with the father and son. If it were not for the kid's mischievous behavior, it would have been a happy and harmonious scene. Other than the father and son, His Royal Highness and his two retainers, Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng, were all riding horses. Princess Jing and Pei and the Murong siblings, Nan Wei and her brother, rode in two separate carriages. The old sword god and Blue Bird were the coachmen. This small group of people headed all the way to the northeast. At first, His Royal Highness not only seized the time to ask Old Manly for advice in martial arts, but he also took the time to go to the carriage and play a few rounds with the caged Princess Pei. Later, when they got close to the famous isolated city along the coast, he rode alone and became taciturn. Murong Tong Huang was fine, but Murong Wuzhu's temperament was weak and she was not good at hiding her emotions. Ever since she met His Royal Highness, she had a very good impression of this handsome and confident young master. Especially after the battle on the snowy plains, it was His Royal Highness who had personally moved the boulder in their hearts. Anyone with a discerning eye would be sure that as long as the heir apparent joked about marrying him, she would probably shy away and accept his offer. Along the way, she would always sneakily lift the curtain and look at his back more than at the sea. There were thousands of kinds of injuries in the world. Emotional injuries were incurable, but there was no cure for mental illness. Surprisingly, Murong Tong Huang did not reprimand her and seemed to let nature take its course. They arrived. Looking up, they could see the towering outer wall of Martial Emperor City. The horses were intelligent. They did not need Su Fingnian to pull the reins and they would stop on their own. His Royal Highness from Beiliang did not look at the wall. Instead, he turned to look at the surface of the eastern sea and was lost in thought. After waiting for a long time, Blue Bird asked softly, "Young master, are we not going to enter the city?" Su Fingnian said softly, "Enter the city." He took the lead. The Martial Emperor's city was a lone city that was independent of the dynasty. Therefore, the guards at the city gate were mostly decorations. They did not need any guide to enter the city unless they were martial artists who violated the rules of the Martial Emperor's city and were not allowed to enter the city. The rest were treated equally regardless of whether they were commoners, nobles, or ministers. It did not matter if they rode on horses, jumped, or crawled into the city. Of course, ever since Wang Xianji became the city lord, the Martial Emperor's city had never opened its gates to welcome guests. Even when the emperor who unified the spring and autumn period entered the city, the second in the world did not come out of the inner city to welcome him. It was the first time that Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng stepped into the Martial Emperor's city. Even though they were used to the storms of the Jianghu, they still felt extremely heavy when they walked into the shadow of the city gate from outside the city. There were countless cities in the world. For the past 100 years, the martial arts evaluation was held once every 20 years. Only this city gate had seen almost all of the top 10 experts. The current outstanding figures who stood at the top of the martial arts world, such as Dong Tai, who rode on a donkey and carried a peach blossom branch, and Chao Chongqing, who was dressed in black, walked past. They were all like the people of the Jianghu around Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng. They had to pass through the city gate and follow the main road to face the inner city. There was a monster with the surname Wang, who claimed to be the second in the world. 2 years ago, there seemed to be a Western Shu swordsman named Jianzhou Wang. He carried a sword case and walked past the city gate for the second time. Unfortunately, he only walked twice and left behind 6 famous swords. In the end, he did not even leave the city with his life. He just sat there and died on the city gate. Su Fingnian dismounted and led the horse forward. After walking for a while, he saw a wine stall by the side of the road. After hesitating for a while, he sat down and asked the waiter, "Do you have wine?" "Yes, yes, yes. We sell wine. How can we not have wine? We have all the good wine from all over the world here." The sharp-eyed shop owner saw that this young master was dressed in fine clothes and had an extraordinary aura. He thought that a big fat sheep had come. He told the waiter, who always felt that he only took money and was not willing to do anything, to scram to the side. He personally went up to the young master and praised himself. He jogged a few steps and came in front of the young master. Seeing the dishes on the table, he smiled flatteringly and said, "Young master, we have Zweiking, Liangzhou Laojiao, Jian Nanchun, and Jinling Daku. What would you like to drink?" The young master smiled and said, "How about rice wine?" The shop owner hesitated for a while. He did have rice wine, but it could not be sold for a high price. No matter how hard he tried, he would not be able to get a lot of money. Just as he was about to persuade the young man in front of him to change to those famous wines that cost more money, the young master turned his head and looked at the inner city wall. He said firmly, "Rice wine will do." The shop owner rolled his eyes and said with a smile, "Judging from your accent, you must be from Beiliang, right? Yellow rice wine is good." To be honest, our yellow rice wine is a century-old brand in the city. Although a pot of wine costs 20 taels of silver, which is a bit expensive, but you get what you pay for. It's definitely worth it. By the way, do you know about the competition that everyone in Jianghu knew about a few years ago? My goodness, I am an honest person. I did not say that it was a once-in-100 years event, but a once-in-a-decade event. Before the old swordsman Huang competed with the mayor, he drank a lot of rice wine at our stall. He praised our wine and said that he did not spend 20 taels of silver in vain. This swordsman is amazing. He has 6 of the 10 famous swords in the world. Young master, you said it yourself. How can the swordsman Huang be weak? Isn't that right? Alas, it is a pity that this swordsman did not drink enough rice wine at our stall. As the old saying goes, drinking wine strengthens one's courage. If he had another pot, he might accidentally use his skills as a sword immortal. The young master only listened to the shop owner's chatter and did not say anything. The servant girl in green who did not get off the carriage pursed her lips tightly. She wanted to say something but stopped. In the end, she did not open her mouth to disturb the young master. The old man with the sheepskin fur coat closed his eyes and dozed off. The young master finally said, "Give me a pot of wine and 2 bowls." Chapter 334. The tavern owner was stunned but still did as he was told. He thought that although the child had brought a lot of servants, none of them sat down. Why did he ask for 2 bowls? The tavern owner who brought the wine and bowls was in a very good mood. The cost of a pot was less than 1 tael of silver, but he asked for 20 taels of silver. He wanted to pour wine for this generous child for the first time. While he was secretly delighted, he couldn't help muttering that the wanderer from outside was so easy to fool. The child who had been cheated once didn't seem to mind the money at all. He said calmly, "I'll pour the wine myself." The tavern owner didn't want to be snubbed. He said cheerfully, "I remember clearly that the old swordsman sat on the right side of you at the same table." The child said, He poured 2 bowls of wine, one of which was on the right side of the table. He took the bowl in front of him and took a sip. He looked up and smiled. "The old man with the sword case is missing 2 front teeth, right?" The tavern owner thought for a while and nodded. He was a little nervous. Could it be that the Beiliang child and the master swordsman surnamed Huang knew each other? If it was true, the 20 taels of silver that he hadn't gotten used to would be a hot potato. The young master smiled and said slowly, "Also, that old man with missing front teeth definitely doesn't have 20 taels of silver to pay you. At most, he would pour out all his copper coins to buy a bowl or 2 of rice wine and drink it sparingly, right?" The tavern owner was completely flustered and his face was stiff. Although the people in the martial emperor's city were born with an indescribable sense of superiority and were used to squinting at the Jianghu people from outside, there was a limit to this sense of superiority. In this world, no matter how they made a living, didn't they have to weigh their own weight when dealing with people? The more humble a family was, the more shrewd and calculative they were. If they didn't have a good eye for the wind, how could they make others willingly take out silver and copper coins from their pockets? Although the owner of the wine stall was an old sparrow who liked to point out the world and had seen many so-called masters, it was just a glib tongue. Anyway, no one would care if he scolded or praised him. If he accidentally hit an iron plate and delayed making money, it would not be good in the end. Fortunately, the young master didn't argue with him about the lie and continued to drink. This made the owner of the wine stall feel relieved. He didn't dare to boast anymore and went to stand behind the cabinet, carefully guessing who this young man was. He stared at the long and short sabers hanging from the young master's waist. TSK, what a rare good saber. Could he really be the son of a powerful Bailiang family? However, he had never heard of any famous sects or martial arts families in Bailiang. Ever since the death of the previous generation spear immortal, Wuxia, Bailiang did not have any capable experts. In that poor place, Bailiang's 300,000 cavalrymen were the most frightening. It was said that the scholars, rangers, and the like were all very ordinary. No one stood out. The curtains of the two carriages had been lifted. Murong Tonghuang and Murong Wuzhu both looked at the silent His Royal Highness and felt somewhat confused. Princess Jing and Pei Nanwei had seen many different faces of His Royal Highness, but she had never seen Su Fingnian at this place. He didn't say anything, didn't smile, and didn't grieve. Unexpectedly, he made people feel inexplicably worried, like a child who had made a mistake. A child? Pei Nanwei sneered. Could a child walk out of the reeds outside Xiangfan City alive? Could he turn the whole bull gang upside down? Could he make Xiao Danping of Mount Longhu rush back to the Taoist master's residence from the capital? But why did he put 2 bowls and drink that cheap pot of yellow wine? The pot of wine was not big to begin with. Fortunately, the bowls were also small. However, he only poured 5 bowls at most. After drinking 3 bowls, the young master only had 1 bowl left, excluding the bowl on the table to his right. The bowls touched, and he still drank it all in 1 gulp. In the eyes of the wine stall's owner, the young man who was somewhat mysterious narrowed his eyes. He seemed to be drinking to his heart's content and was slightly tipsy. He muttered, "Old Huang, when I was chatting with you, I asked you what was the style of an expert. What did you say?" "That's right, it's an expert who can make the clouds of the 9th heaven fall and the waters of the 4 seas rise. You said that a person with this kind of ability is a real expert. You're talking about that old monster Wang from Martial Emperor City. Judging from his age, he should have this kind of ability. But you clearly know that old monster Wang is about to become an immortal, so why did you come here to ask for a beating? Didn't you always say that when we walk the Jianghu, we should run if we can't win, and when the situation is critical, we should run away?" Unknowingly, Old Manly got off the carriage and walked towards the wine stall. He directly sat down and scolded, "Little Su, what nonsense are you talking about? If you don't have the guts, then scram with your tail between your legs. You're embarrassing this old man by staying here." The wine stall's owner was shocked by the dirty old man's carelessness. He was very puzzled as to why this armless old coachman didn't even have the slightest sense of seniority. What was even stranger was that the young man didn't get angry. He only said softly, "Otherwise." The old man wearing the sheepskin coat glanced at the city wall filled with martial weapons. He sneered and said, "Let me remind you out of kindness. No matter what you do, this old man promised Su Xiao that he would protect you from death." That young man used his finger to point at the city wall. He could vaguely see a purple-black box. He smiled and said, "I don't want to do anything big. With my little weight, I can't do anything big. I just want to take this bowl of wine and go there to take a look." The wine stall's owner subconsciously rolled his eyes. This outsider was an outsider. He didn't know the rules at all and didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. How could ordinary people go up the city wall? For almost 60 years, how many people wanted to force their way up the city wall but were all beaten down? He had been doing business here for more than 10 years. He had seen some so-called experts who didn't know what was good for them and wanted to directly float up the city wall. Without exception, they all didn't have a good ending. Before they could leap up 50 to 60 feet, they would provoke the experts in the inner city to attack them. They were all like kites without wind and fell to their deaths at the foot of the wall. They couldn't be more dead. How were the sword god Dong Tai and Chao Qingyi's skills? What was their status in Jianghu? It was rumored that when they challenged the city lord a few years ago, didn't they have to follow the rules and go up the martial tower level by level? In the eyes of the wine stall's owner, the one-armed old man who was an eyesore smiled and said, "What's so difficult about that?" After the young man heard that, he slowly stood up and picked up the bowl of wine. He turned his head and said to Blue Bird, "You all wait here." Pei Nanwei widened her limpid eyes. It was unbelievable. Was this guy crazy? Even a woman outside of the Jianghu like her knew that there was a second under heaven in the inner city. On this day, on the bustling streets of the Martial Emperor City, all the visitors and citizens of the Martial Emperor City saw an unforgettable scene. A handsome young man walked with a bowl in his hand and said in a clear voice, "Wang Xianji, may I ask what is meant by the clouds of the ninth heaven drooping down, and what is meant by the waters of the four seas standing up?" This sentence was said with vigorous inner energy, and it echoed through half of the city. Immediately after, according to the estimates of the busybodies, there were at least 1,900 swords that were unsheathed at the same time and hung in the sky. And this magnificent phenomenon was caused by a one-armed old man who had been alone in the Jianghu for too many years. Wang Xianji. Li Chungang is here to visit the Eastern Sea. I want to borrow this city of swords to fight with you. Chapter 335. The Jianghu was indeed too big. Even if an immortal smashed a Mount Tai into the Jianghu and caused a huge splash, there would be no ripples after a decade or 100 years. Therefore, most of the Jianghu people were forgetful. They lived less than 100 years at most. 70 was a rare occurrence since ancient times. Li Chungang became famous too early. He was the best at a young age and was almost invincible at 30. Who could compete with him? This old sword god rose to fame early, but he also fell early. After he lost to Wang Xianji of the same generation, his wooden horse and ox were broken, and very few rumors of him entered the Jianghu. Over time, as his close friends and beauties turned to dust one after another, even some old antiques of the current Jianghu had a vague impression of Li Chungang, let alone those young and middle-aged Jianghu people. To these people, not to mention the old but strong Wang Xianji, in terms of swordsmanship, Qi Xianxia of the Dragon Tiger Mountain and Wang Xiaoping of the Wudang sect were on par with each other. However, compared to Deng Te, who was full of immortal aura, they were still inferior. Jianghu changed, but the one thing that remained unchanged was that swordsmen were always the most common in Jianghu. They were like carps crossing the river, densely packed together. Deng Te was undoubtedly the only sword god in the eyes of Jianghu today. However, this sword god did not like carrying a sword, which was a strange thing. If a sword user lost to a saber user or a spear user, he could say that he had lost. But if the saber user or the spear user brought out their best masters, who could beat sword god Deng, who did not use a sword? Rumor had it that sword god Deng was born with the back of a tiger and the waist of a bear. He could transform into 3 heads and 6 arms. There was a small yellow pearwood sword box in his bag, which contained more than 10 pocket-sized swords. They were like living creatures raised by the secret technique of the Wu family's sword tomb. They could eat meat when hungry and drink blood when thirsty. It was very mysterious. After they left the box, they could cut off the head on their neck without using qi. Unfortunately, only the Lord of the Martial Emperor City had seen such a superb sword immortal skill. No matter how big the Jianghu was, Sword God Deng was qualified to look down on everyone else. In the martial emperor city, nearly 2,000 swords were unsheathed, forming a shocking sword curtain in the air. Outside the city gate, a tired old donkey stomped its hooves and slowly entered the city. A young man dressed as a book attendant rode the donkey upside down. There was a scabbard hanging on his waist, but his sword was gone. With a face full of regret, he lowered his head and said to a middle-aged man who was leading the donkey, "Master, I bought this sword with great difficulty with copper coins and silver pieces." That Li Chungang said that he was going to borrow the sword in the city. Why did he not let go of mine? We haven't even reached the martial emperor city yet. Old master, you too. You watched as the sword flew out of its scabbard and didn't help me stop it. If this matter were to spread out, how shameful would it be? At that time, where would you put your face? The middle-aged man had an ordinary appearance, but he habitually curled up the corner of his mouth, making it look like he was smiling all the time. At the same time, that unremarkable face of his also became gentle and mellow. He was holding a peach blossom that he plucked from somewhere. His fingers were twirling it gently. He raised his head and looked at the bitter face of the young man. He smiled and teased, "Isn't face all about your face?" That young man who was supposed to be a book attendant was rather arrogant. He rode the donkey himself, and it was fine if he asked his master to lead the donkey on foot, but he even asked his master to carry his luggage. When he heard his master's teasing, he stared at him with his eyes wide open. Then, he became discouraged and asked worriedly, "This Li Chungang said that he was going to borrow the swords. He wouldn't refuse to return them, right?" The man laughed and said, "Old Senior Li, if you didn't fight and just put on a show, I reckon that you would be in trouble. Think about it, if you lost control of almost 2,000 swords, they would all fall from the sky and randomly scatter on the ground. When the time comes, would you be able to recognize which one is yours? Even if you could recognize it, there are so many heroic swordsmen who are going to snatch it. In addition, there are also some who are trying to take advantage of the chaos to steal it. With your small body, would you be able to snatch it back? If you want to return it to its rightful owner, you would have to burn incense. Besides, this is still considered good. If you really fought with Old Man Wang, most of these 1,900 swords would be gone. Then, your sword's aptitude would be average, and it wouldn't be able to withstand a casual wave from Old Man Wang. However, from what I see, Old Senior Li did a good job in borrowing the swords this time. Now that you have bought the swords, you won't be in the mood to do odd jobs for me. Touch your conscience and tell me, have you been half in the mood to cook these days?" To be exact, the young man who was supposed to be a sword attendant said angrily, "Master, you are the one who talks the most. Once you start, there is no end to it. My ears are getting calluses from talking so much." The middle-aged man in coarse hemp clothes was indeed someone with a good temper. He chuckled and said, all right, all right, all right. I will shut up." The young man who was supposed to be a sword attendant but had never carried a sword for his master sighed and said, "Master, can I talk to you about something?" After leading the donkey into the city, the man who was standing on the main street and looking at the inner city wall smiled and said, "Old Senior Li and Old Man Wang are going to fight. Aren't you making things difficult for me?" The sword attendant took a step back and said, "Master, why don't you take advantage of the chaos and pick up 17 or 18 swords for me? Anyway, Master, you are just picking up swords, not stealing or robbing. It doesn't matter." The man smiled knowingly and said, "Look, you were just saying where my face is. If I carry more than 10 swords on my shoulders and run on the street, will I have face?" The sword attendant's heart was as dead as ashes. He said with a sad face, "I have been working hard for more than 600 years by your side. It wasn't easy for me to save 17 taels of silver, and I spent all of them on swords. If I had known, I wouldn't have come to this bullshit martial emperor city." Bullshit. When the man saw that the young man was about to cry, he said with a headache, all right, all right. When there is no one around later, I will help you pick up a good sword. The young man's face suddenly changed. He smiled brightly and said, Master, are you tired? I will help you carry the book box. The man laughed angrily and said, How immoral. If I carry the book box for you, it will be the donkey who will be tired. It is better for me to be tired. The sword attendant grinned and looked up at the gloomy sword curtain above the city. He looked absent-minded and asked softly, Master, who do you think will win if we really fight? The man smiled and said casually, Unless we fight to the death, Old Man Wang has a much higher chance of winning this battle. The sword attendant curled his lips and rolled his eyes. This Li Chungang is too useless. He only knows how to create such a scene to scare people. Isn't he just an embroidered pillow? The man showed a rare dignified expression and said in a low voice, Sanlu, don't be disrespectful to Senior Li. The young man saw that his master was angry, so he didn't dare to say anything and obediently said, Oh. But then, with a face full of unwillingness, he said, That Old Man Wang is just a dog sitting on a pile of dog dung, proclaiming himself as a king. If Old Master were to use your full strength, you would definitely beat him up until his parents wouldn't recognize him. The man laughed and shook his head, I won't count on it in this life. The sword attendant, who didn't care about his master's identity, seemed to be angry at his master's failure and snorted in anger. The man didn't care and said absent-mindedly, You children naturally don't know what it means if Li Chungang wasn't born, swordsmanship would be as long as the night. For 500 years, there have been countless genius swordsmen, but only this senior's swordsmanship cultivation is on par with Ancestor Liu. As for me, I might be lucky enough to be better than Senior Li in killing people, but in terms of swordsmanship cultivation, I'm much weaker. The sword attendant only listened to the good words and said with a smile, Isn't practicing swordsmanship for fighting and killing? The man smiled, You've thought it through. The young sword attendant riding on the donkey had the aura of a master. The man stopped spinning the peach blossom branch and said in surprise, It's here. You're lucky to see it. This fight is really going to happen. It's not all talk and no action. A loud voice came from the attic in the inner city, Li Chungang, please come out of the city and fight with me in the sea. Countless people in the martial emperor city looked up at the same time. A burly white figure was like a comet that blasted from the top of the attic to the East Sea. 1,900 swords pointed at the East Sea. One person jumped on the sword and flew to the East Sea. The strongest battle in the world. Chapter 336. When the two silhouettes left the city and entered the sea, the martial emperor city went through a brief moment of dead silence. Then, a wave of noise broke out in an instant. No matter if it was the common people in the city or the heroes from other places, they all rushed out of the city. If one were to look down from the sky above the city, it was as if 4 torrents had converged near the 4 gates. Then, 3 of the torrents made a turn and rushed towards the East Sea. Some of the impatient Jianghu people who were good at martial arts didn't care about walking at the speed of a tortoise. They directly leaped onto the roofs and vaulted over the walls of the city. Such a spectacular scene of hundreds of people jumping up and down at the same time was indeed rare. In just half a cup of tea's time, the streets of the martial emperor city, which could fit more than 100,000 people, were empty and deserted. After all, the one-armed old man who called himself Li Chungang had the ability to control 1,800 swords. It couldn't be faked. Moreover, Wang Xianji had been overseeing the martial emperor city for more than half a century. Whether it was the divine swordsman Dong Tai or Chao Guanzi, they had never let him out of the city for a battle. Even if one were to use their butts to think, they would know that this outdated old man wearing a sheepskin fur coat was a rather tyrannical character. Such a battle at the pinnacle that was hard to come by. If they missed it, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. The bustling main street was empty in an instant. Even the wine stall owner and the 2 waiters ran out. Only His Royal Highness and the others were forced to stay. Xu Xiu's heart was itching, but entering the martial emperor's city was like treading on thin ice. Moreover, the current grand occasion was created by His Royal Highness and the old divine swordsman. She was already at the center of the whirlpool and didn't dare to follow the crowd out of the city to watch the show. If His Royal Highness made a mistake, the King of Bailiang wouldn't be able to punish the bold Li Chungang and kill her as an example. Xu Xiu couldn't even hope to exchange her life for his. She was destined to suffer a fate worse than death. The expressionless Yang Qingfeng glanced at Xu Xiu from the corner of his eyes and continued to look at the top of the inner city without batting an eyelid. In the center of the inner city, there was a loft towering into the clouds. It was like the Tongtian pavilion that the Emperor of Dongwu spent half of his national treasury to build because a short-sleeved poet beside him said, "I don't dare to speak loudly for fear of alarming the people in the sky." The second in the world had shot out from there and fell into the East Sea to challenge Li Chungang to a duel in the dark misty ocean. Yang Qingfeng's expression was normal. In fact, his excitement was no less than Xu Xiu's. As long as one was a martial artist, who wouldn't be fascinated by Li Chunggang's immortal style and heroic spirit of borrowing swords from the entire city? Moreover, the feud between the two seniors was a major storyline that ran through the entire Jianghu. Ever since Li Chungang left Bailiang, he had split the river 200 feet away from the gates of hell, defeated the Wu family sword crown outside Xiangfan City, and achieved the sword immortal realm in the Great Snow Plains. Could it be that all of these were just to pave the way for today's battle? Little Worm took advantage of his father's stupefied state and struggled to jump off the tall horse. Probably because his legs were weak, he fell flat on his face. After getting up, he patted the dust off and went to the wine stall to pick a few bottles of good wine for himself. After sitting down, he began to drink and entertain himself like an old man. Finally, he found his conscience and waved his hand at his father, who had become a foreign official, and said with a smile, "Dad, let's drink. It's free." Long Yuxuan was not in the mood to drink. He was afraid that His Royal Highness and the old god of swords Li Chungang would both die in Wu City. As a foreign official of Bailiang, if he was trapped in the city, he would be torn apart by 5 horses or trampled into meat paste. Long Yuxuan did not get off his horse. Instead, it was a man who came into the city with a donkey who smelled the wine. He picked a table far away from the naughty children and rummaged through the cabinets to get a few bottles of wine. However, he did not forget to take out a few pieces of silver and put them on the table. The young swordsman sitting on the donkey's side and jumped off the donkey's back. He carefully stared at the group of strangers. They were very strange partners. The dead man's face was as white as snow. The coachman was a delicate and pretty older sister dressed in green. There was also the aunt who rode on the horse. Her breasts were so high that they were about to burst out of her clothes. The young swordsman, who was inexperienced, felt his heart skip a beat. Especially after Xu Xiu gave him a flirtatious glance, the young swordsman's face turned red and his breathing became erratic. The swordsman who did not live up to his name turned his head away, not daring to look at the aunt. The old Taoist nun, the naive child, and the beautiful woman. These 3 types of people were not to be trifled with. If one's cultivation was not high enough, one could fail miserably. After the young swordsman named Songlu lowered his head, he secretly thought that although the aunt was pretty, she was a little older and did not look like a proper lady from a respectable family. He did not like her. Just as the youth was feeling regretful, he caught a glimpse of a face through the curtain of the carriage. He was instantly stunned. A beauty through the bead curtain. Sanlu felt as if he was struck by lightning. The middle-aged man who was drinking leisurely saw the sword boy lose his soul and smiled. He followed the youth's dazed gaze and saw an androgynous beautiful face. The boy had good eyesight. If one were to say that Sanlu was drooling over a beauty, this boy would be wronged. The girl behind the curtain was beautiful, but compared to the girl's surnamed Shin he saw in the Luotian garden not long ago, she was still lacking. She also didn't see San Lu lose his soul like this. The girl behind the curtain seemed to be annoyed by San Lu's gaze. She frowned slightly and let go of the curtain, not wanting to see him again. San Lu slowly regained his senses, feeling ashamed of his inferiority. The man found it funny. Could it be that he really fell in love with her? The man didn't know anything about love between men and women, so he didn't know how to untie the knot in San Lu's heart. He just let nature take its course. Chapter 337. After the flower thief Long Yuxuan saw the master and servant pair, he was worried. It wasn't strange for someone to ride a donkey, but a donkey with a peach blossom branch in addition to the martial emperor's city was not to be underestimated. Although the new sword god Dong Tai liked to carry a peach blossom branch around the Wulin, it attracted many men and women who blindly worshipped the sword god and imitated him, causing some old-school Wulin people to be disgusted. Imagine, every time the peach blossom blossoms, walking on the streets, 3 out of 10 sword-wielding heroines would carry a peach blossom branch around. Wouldn't it be boring? This was the same logic as when the official Chao Chongqing caused the green shirt wave. At that time, the whole city was wearing green clothes, and it was popular all over the country. In terms of popularity, the top 3 of the top 10 experts were Wang Xianji, Dong Tai, and Chao Chongqing. They were 10 streets ahead of the other 7. Long Yuxuan naturally didn't have the chance to see the real face of the sword god Dong Tai, but he knew that not just anyone who rode a donkey and carried a peach blossom was a sword god. But this gentleman in front of him didn't look like an ordinary person. Long Xuanyu was facing a great enemy. Seeing the little bug drinking wine without knowing the immensity of heaven and earth, he hesitated for a moment, then got off the horse and carefully sat next to the child, separating the brat from the master and servant pair. On the empty main road of the martial emperor's city, His Royal Highness carried a cup of wine and walked forward. At the foot of the wall, there were 6 famous martial emperor's city's martial slaves. There were a total of 12 martial slaves, and all of them were top-notch experts of the martial emperor's city who had lost to Wang Xianji and had to become her slaves for the rest of their lives. There were 4 swordsmen, 3 saber masters, 1 spear master, 2 fist master, 1 zither master, and 1 chess master. The martial emperor's city sent half of their slaves to stand at the foot of the city wall. It wasn't a method of hospitality, but to make His Royal Highness, who was riding a white horse out of Liangzhou, retreat. The martial emperor's city never had any laws, only the city rules set by Wang Xianji. Here, the words of the emperor and the nobles were useless. No matter who it was, they had to follow the rules, unless their fists were strong enough, so strong that even the land immortal Wang Xianji had to take them seriously. The swordsman San Lu secretly knocked on the curtain of the carriage several times, but he couldn't see that stunning face again. He could only drink to boost his courage and softly asked, "Master, who is that young master?" His tone and courage are too big, daring to provoke old man Wang. Now that Li Chungang has left the city, how is he going to get to the top of the city wall? 6 martial slaves close to the first stage realm, won't they easily beat him into a pig's head? The man who was drinking with his head lowered narrowed his eyes. Looking at the back of the young man, he vaguely felt a sense of familiarity. He said absent-mindedly, "Oh, him. Ma, who is a distant relative. According to seniority, he should call me uncle." The sword boy was shocked on the spot. "Master, ever since San Lu met you, you have never mentioned his family background. Why don't you tell me about it today?" The man thought for a moment and held the bowl in the air. Finally, he smiled and said, "Back then, when I was practicing the sword in a certain place, his mother, who is also a distant cousin, once gave me a meal, a life-saving grace, and a teaching grace. I brought you to Martial Emperor's city this time to repay that kindness." The young man said bluntly, "Master, I don't want to criticize you, but according to what you said, this kindness is too great. How are you going to repay it?" Plus, you two are related. If you are stingy, I can't stand it. Let's see if I will boil water and cook for you in the future. The man ridiculed, do you think I don't know what you are thinking? Didn't you think that young master is related to the girl you fell in love with at first sight, so you want to use my help to do something good? This is called being generous. Otherwise, with your stingy character, you won't get half a copper coin even if you beat him 10 times with the rod. The sword boy flew into a rage out of humiliation. He no longer paid attention to the harsh master, but the corner of his eyes looked at the carriage. He was afraid that the girl would hear him and have a bad impression of him. The man sighed softly. Before Wuxia left the Wu family's sword tomb, I said goodbye to her at the Sword Mountain. Later, she entered the imperial city alone for lame Su. I didn't have time to follow her, so she fell ill. I feel guilty about it to this day. As he spoke, the man bent down and took out a yellow pear wood box. With a swipe of his finger, he gently pushed it open, revealing 12 small, exquisite, pocket-sized swords of different lengths. The swords were of different colors. Before he moved, the harmless-looking man turned to the two carriages and said with a smile, I am Dong Tai. I owe Princess Wuxia a favor when I was practicing my swordsmanship. Today, I will repay half of it. I hope you won't stop me. Long Yuxuan spat out a mouthful of wine and coughed violently. He was so scared that his face turned pale. Different from Princess Wuxia's swordsmanship that saved people, Dong Tai only practiced swordsmanship to kill people. He didn't show the 12 swords in the box to ordinary people. This time, he made an exception and used 6 swords. The heartless little bug showed a dignified expression for the first time. Tsing Yi held the ancient spear tightly. He didn't take the man who called himself Dong Tai lightly because of his friendly attitude. Xu Xiao and Yang Qingfeng looked at each other. Murong Tonghuang lifted the curtain again. He opened his eyes wide and frowned. The young sword boy who was closest to Dong Tai was full of pride and vigor. For a moment, everyone nearby held their breaths. How many people in the world were lucky enough to see the self-proclaimed peach blossom sword god kill people? There were 12 swords neatly arranged in the yellow pear sword box. The longest was no longer than the middle finger, and the shortest was only as long as the thumb. They saw the number 1 swordsman in Jianghu, who was far more famous than the old god of sword Li Chungang, smile. He stretched out his index finger and flicked the hilt of the first red sword in his left hand. He said calmly, black armor. The small sword jumped into the air. After a slight delay, it shot toward the top of the city wall. Dong Tai stretched out his middle finger and tapped it with 2 fingers. Childhood sweetheart. The 2 swords jumped into the air with lively spiritual energy and flew away again. The last time he tapped it with 3 fingers. Spring water, morning dew, peach blossom. The small sword box happened to be half empty. Even Princess Consort Jing, and was curious and fearful of this legendary man. Following his gesture, Xu Xiong, Yang Qingfeng, Long Yuxuan, and the others all looked down the city walls. Only the little bug and blue bird kept staring at the inconspicuous yellow sword box. The people watching from afar didn't know that the man had just flicked the swords out of the box. Almost in an instant, the 6 small swords had returned to the air 2 feet above the box and slowly fell down. It was not until Deng Tea closed the yellow pear wood box that the crowd finally realized what had happened. They saw the 6 slaves' heads seemed to have been pierced by something, 6 streams of blood spurted out, 6 corpses were knocked against the city wall, and finally slowly fell limp to the ground. At this moment Dong Tai stood up. He didn't touch the yellow box containing the 12 priceless flying swords. He smiled at the little bug who was shaking his head and said, Dong Tai congratulates old Immortal Zhao for returning to his natural state and being free and unfettered. Please give this box to His Royal Highness and tell him that Dong Tai's killing techniques with flying swords are in this box. The little bug sighed with a sad face. You're just going to leave like this? Are you forcing Wang Xianji to fight Li Chungang to the death? If Li Chungang loses, how can Su Fengnian walk out of the martial emperor city? What's the point of giving him the 12 flying swords? Dong Tai picked up the peach blossom branch and led the donkey over. He smiled and said, "Old Immortal, this has nothing to do with Dong Tai." The little bug rolled his eyes and said helplessly, "I really don't understand the current Jianghu." The flower thief Long Yushuan's eyeballs almost fell to the ground. Without any obstacles, His Royal Highness smoothly walked to the top of the city wall. He approached the red sandalwood sword box and sat down cross-legged. He put the bowl of wine in front of him and looked at the eastern sea. Perhaps the old monster in the martial emperor's city knew about the situation in the city and was really angry. The sea surface was immediately stirred up. Was the old man really going to teach the eastern sea how to stand on its water? Su Fengnian looked at the river surface. The waves were getting stronger and stronger. The curtain of swords was like a black cloud pressing down on the city. He suddenly grinned and said, "The situation is urgent, let's go. Old Huang, when I come back alive from Beimang, I'll come and see you again." On this day, other than the battle between the two sword deities of the Jianghu in the past 100 years, there was another matter that shook the world. The young chief of the Wudong Mountain rode a crane down the mountain. Chapter 338. Qi Xianxia was a serious Taoist Longhu, but when he arrived at Mount Wudong and stayed there for a long time, he was also greatly harmed by Hong Xixiang. He was either dragged to repair the temple or chopped firewood and burned charcoal to build a bamboo house. During this period, it was inevitable that he would bump into several generations of Taoists of Wudong. At first, the Taoist children of Wudong's younger generation did not have a good expression on their faces. Later on, when they saw this Taoist from Mount Longhu, although he always had a straight face as if they owed him tens of thousands of strings of coins, his heart was not bad. In addition, the young martial granduncle who was also the chief treated him with respect. Furthermore, when the Taoist children heard that this fellow's swordsmanship was on par with their 6 martial granduncles, the bolder ones plucked up the courage to ask him about the flying sword Dharma. Qi Xianxia was also generous and did not have any prejudice against his family background. He answered all questions. In the end, a large group of Taoist children who admired the sword Immortal's elegance and the Jianghu's reputation followed behind him and chattered non-stop. The remote bamboo house that Qi Xianxia lived in also became a lot livelier. Unlike Mount Longhu, which had countless golden rules and jade rules, Mount Wudong did not pay much attention to them. Qi Xianxia originally thought that he would be very uncomfortable. Unexpectedly, not to mention those mischievous and naive Taoist children, even a few of his senior brothers who rode bulls, Chen Zhao, Song Jiming, Yu Xingrui, and the others, had indifferent interactions with him. Unknowingly, Qi Xianxia lost some of his original intention to compete with the bull riders. He calmed his mind and practiced swordsmanship on Mount Wudong. Occasionally, he would go to the Taishu Temple on the main peak to admire the sunrise and sunset. Looking into the distance, the 72 peaks in the 4 directions were like lotus petals protecting the main peak. Together, they presented a posture of worship. Every time he finished his breathing exercises and retracted his gaze, Qi Xianxia could not help but look at the celestial sword that was left behind by Ancestor Lu. It hung under the eaves of the Great Gong. Qi Xianxia had a lot of respect for Ancestor Lu, who had not appeared in the world for 500 years. Otherwise, he would not have wholeheartedly practiced swordsmanship and pursued the ultimate sword technique of taking the head of an enemy from 1,000 miles away. In Taoism, there were 2 types of swordsmanship. Since ancient times, Taoist swordsmanship was respected. Simply put, Taoist swordsmanship cut off the 7 emotions and 6 desires, while Taoist swordsmanship cut off demons and evils. The former was beneficial for cultivation and had no harm, while the latter was unavoidably tainted by karma. There was once a heavenly master of Mount Longhu who had encountered a rare heavenly tribulation because of this and almost died on the spot. If not for Mount Longhu's prompt decision to sacrifice a few dragon pool lotus of fortune as the price, the consequences would be unimaginable. Mount Longhu did not have any objections and regrets when Qi Xianxia walked the path of Daoist swordsmanship. Today was the birthday of Yujing God Jinwu the Great Emperor. There was an endless stream of pilgrims who went up the mountain to burn incense. Speaking of which, it was strange. Ever since the person who rode the bull took over as the chief, although there were no immortal deeds like the previous chief, Wang Zhongluo, who could break a river with one finger, and this person with the surname Hong did not even leave the mountain once, the incense on Mount Wudong was getting more and more prosperous. Qi Xianxia often listened to his fellow disciple Bai Yu talk about fate and knew a thing or two about it. He observed the clouds at the main peak. It should be known that Wudong was located in the northwest of the continent, and the fate of the world had always flowed from the west to the east, like a rolling river flowing to the sea. However, in this period of time, even Qi Xianxia, who was a layman, could vaguely see the sea of clouds surging and gathering outside the 72 peaks. It was just that he did not know when it would accumulate and erupt. Fortunately, Qi Xianxia was never willing to worry unnecessarily. Whether or not Xuanwu would rise, whether or not Longhu would prosper, who was the real Taoist ancestral court, who was bestowed with the title of king by the imperial court, none of these were important to him. Qi Xianxia's heart suddenly jumped and his eyes widened. He raised his head and looked at the celestial sword that had not been unsheathed for a full 500 years. This ancient sword that had been silent for 1,000 years after Lu Zhu ascended to immortality was actually trembling like a dragon. The sea of clouds on the 72 peaks boiled and finally, like 72 white dragons swimming towards the main peak. Hundreds of yellow cranes soared and circled. The vast number of pilgrims who flocked to the mountain for the birthday of Jinwu the Great Emperor raised their heads almost at the same time to see this strange phenomenon. No one knew who shouted that Jinwu the Great Emperor had appeared, but tens of thousands of fearful pilgrims knelt on the ground together. If you told the ordinary people in the world about the saint scriptures, mysterious morals, and profound Buddhism, it would not be of much use to them. They usually liked and feared things that were shallow and obvious, just like the ordinary people who saw the swords, spears, and sticks in the hands of the ruffians, or the embroidered patchwork clothes and palanquins of the officials. Therefore, Buddhism had the 18 hells, which scared people and made them tremble in fear. Taoism had all kinds of Jinren and immortals to save the world and help the people. These things were often disdained by the scholars and masters, but to the ordinary people in the streets and alleys, it was the most frightening thing. After the death of the Big Dipper Lord, Jinwu the Great Emperor took charge of Wudong and issued edicts to the north. In its heyday, countless pilgrims from the south would come to Wudong to burn incense and pray for blessings. Now, Wudong's reputation was waning, but most of the people in the north still believed in it. Especially with the sea of clouds rolling overhead and the yellow cranes crying together, who would not worship it as if it were a god. Chen Yao, who was looking for an ancient book in the Sutra Tower, staggered to the window and opened it with trembling lips and tears running down his face. Senior brother Wang, little brother has succeeded. Song Jiming, who was refining pills in the mountains, did not care about the pills that were regarded as immortal objects by ordinary people. He fell to his knees and kowtowed. Wudong's 36th disciple, Song Jiming, welcomes the founder. Yu Xingrui, who had found a disciple who was in seclusion in the East Sea, was sitting on a cushion and teaching the disciple the Nigong Heart Sutra. He clapped his hands and laughed until tears came out of his eyes. He said excitedly, "Li Yufu, your uncle master is finally coming down the mountain." 72 peaks faced the summit and 24 streams flowed. Among them, the longest waterfall was lifted and straightened as if it was assisted by the gods. It led to the adjacent Little Lotus Peak where only a young Taoist practiced the way of the heavens. The waterfall was like a white chain across the sky. When the tens of thousands of pilgrims saw this scene, they felt as if they were in a fairyland. It was even quieter. The huge Wudong mountain was so quiet that you could almost hear a pin drop. Who was the one who built the bridge? Qi Xianxia saw the ancient sword fly out of the Taishu temple with its scabbard. It followed the sword and flew along the water bridge hanging between the two peaks to Little Lotus Peak. He saw the person riding the ox and leaning against the tortoise camel tablet. He muttered to himself, "Today is the day to interpret the lot. It's best to go to Jiangnan." The immortal ancient sword flew around the young chief, as if it was reuniting with an old friend. It was happy and excited. Qi Xianxia, who was excited, shouted, "Hong Shixiang, who are you? Why is Ancestor Lu's sword connected to you?" The young martial granduncle on the ox turned a deaf ear. He was in a daze. He pinched his fingers and calculated again. After a long time, he exhaled and smiled at Qi Xianxia. He slowly got up and stroked the ancient sword that was suspended in the air. He touched it with his finger and the 3-foot sword was as clear as water. The scabbard separated and he said softly, "You go to Jiangnan, you go to Longhu. I'll be there soon." The scabbard went to Longhu Mountain and the sword flew towards Jiangnan. The ancient sword went down the mountain first. Hong Shixiang, who was wearing a plain Taoist robe, patted the dust off. He rode a huge yellow crane and looked towards Jiangnan. Jiangnan is good. It's best if it's a red coat. Qi Xianxia looked up at the yellow crane and said in shock, "Ancestor Lu." Qi Xianxia was originally shocked to the extreme, but when he saw the yellow crane return, the guy who was no longer riding an ox hastily jumped off. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Let's go greet the senior martial brothers first before leaving the mountain." "Oh right, Brother Qi, I'll have to trouble you to take care of the Taoist children's studies." Even the inflexible Qi Xianxia couldn't help but want to swear. What kind of immortal is this? The newly appointed headmaster, who had never walked out of the Black Tortoise Dang Xing Memorial Archway when he was young, was scolded by His Highness as a coward. He finally had the guts to go down the mountain. It was a natural wonder. The Taoist rode the yellow crane into the distance. The yellow crane shuttled through the clouds and flew past the northwest city of Fish Dragon Pass. It was majestic. The pass locked the Yin border and the defense line was continuous. It was one of the choke points of the Empire's North Desert. Some soldiers climbed up the city and looked into the distance. Who was the first to see the yellow crane? There seemed to be another person sitting on the back of the crane. There was someone. There really was one person. This news immediately spread like wildfire. The soldiers at the border all rushed to the commanding heights of the city wall. Sure enough, they saw an immortal who looked like a Taoist riding a crane to the east. The impregnable pass in the northwest immediately exploded. When the yellow crane whistled over their heads, everyone looked up blankly. They didn't dare to say anything for fear of disturbing the celestial who was free and unfettered in the sky. In the prosperous Central Plains, there was a yellow crane tower standing on the banks of the great river. Its wings and horns were rugged and heroic. There was once an immortal poet who left a famous poem that was handed down from generation to generation. It was said that 500 years ago, Lu Dongxian from Guanxi cultivated for 200 years and finally became an immortal. He swore that if there was injustice in the world, he wouldn't be willing to ascend to the heaven. He traveled leisurely in the mortal world with poetry, swords, and wine. He once rode a crane past this tower, causing purple clouds to rise from the east. There were more than 300 famous poems from different dynasties and generations on the walls of the tower. Today, a grand poetry gathering was held upstairs. The scholars of the Central Plains were in the mood for wine and poetry. Suddenly, they heard that a magical yellow crane flew from the west to the east. They all came to the corridor to watch. When they got closer, they suddenly realized that there was an immortal sitting on the crane. The immortal style was not inferior to Lu Dongshuan's in the past. The scholars and poets looked at each other in disbelief. Was there really an immortal on land in the world? Chapter 339. 500 years ago, he left on a crane. 500 years later, he returned on a crane. In the vast expanse of mist, the yellow crane flew across the yellow crane tower. An old scholar said in a daze, I have witnessed this scene. My life was not in vain. Jiangnan. Old people, old scenes, old memories. The autumn wind rose, autumn leaves fell, people gathered and parted, autumn crows perched and startled, missing each other and not knowing when they would meet again. This scene was embarrassing. The beautiful peonies of Baogua Temple withered one after another. In the autumn season, there were still some 100-year-old osmanthus to be admired. The trees were old, the branches were evergreen, and the fragrance assailed the nostrils. Recently, the Liu family of Hutton County had overshadowed the other three families. It was like the osmanthus tree in front of a pair of women, growing alone in the forest. The head of the Liu family took the blame and resigned from the Imperial College. After drinking wine, he profited from the misfortune and entered the Ministry of Rites, becoming a second-rank official. After the carefree Sanren Tongshi sword Immortal Liu Baijie left Retreat Garden, he went to the capital and immediately assumed the position of Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War. He was only one step away from becoming a cabinet official. The two brothers echoed each other from a distance. The Jiangnan Liu family became famous overnight. They had to re-evaluate the family of the king of Beiliang. The family's reputation rose, but the most beautiful widow in Gangnam-do with a bad reputation was completely neglected. The scholar Liu Lighting was dragged to death on a horse. Who in Hutton County dared to get close to her? It was said that the widow caught a cold and her body, which was not weak, became thin. It was said that she lost a lot of weight. The men in Gangnam-do had complicated thoughts, but the women were united against a common enemy. Many of those who had suffered losses hurried to the temples and Taoist temples to burn incense and pray to the bodhisattvas. They wished that the fox spirit would die sooner. When the noble women who were familiar with her met, they would curse her in private to feel better. Now that the center of power of the Liu family had moved to the capital and the court, especially after the Tongshi sword Immortal left Gangnam-do, it was inevitable that the Liu family of Hutton County would not be able to gain any advantage over trivial matters. The rumors that had been suppressed became more and more intense. The attacks and curses against the widow were reignited. The osmanthus seeds fell in front of the old osmanthus trees. The maid Chow said angrily, Miss, those shrews don't learn their lesson. They're starting to talk bad about you again. I really want to slap their mouths. Compared to before, she was indeed a much thinner woman. She reached out and tapped the tip of her maidservant's nose. She smiled charmingly and said, You're still talking about others. Aren't you a little shrew yourself? The young maidservant with delicate features giggled and said, I heard from the air that Miss used to love wearing red dresses and red garments. Why has Chow Air never seen it before? The woman looked absent-minded and said softly, You're still young, you won't understand even if I tell you. Dumb Chow muttered, He's not small anymore. The woman bent down and picked up a handful of golden osmanthus seeds. Her hands were filled with the fragrance of osmanthus flowers. She raised her head and looked at the osmanthus leaves in silence. Chow, 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 chow. The pale-faced woman shook her head and said, Let's wait a little longer. Chow chow of chow of chow of, chow, 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 kai off chow. The woman smiled. Tell me about it. The maid lowered her head and said, His Royal Highness once chatted with Chow Chow. He said that there was a coward on Mount Wudong who secretly liked you all these years. Chow Chow looked up at the sky and loosened her fingers. The osmanthus seeds fell one by one. She sighed. My brother lied to you. Chow Chow asked cautiously, Actually, you're also waiting in your heart, aren't you? Chow Chow asked. The woman turned her head and flicked her maid's smooth forehead. You shameless girl. Chow Chow's face turned red. She puffed up her cheeks and sulked. You're Su Jihu. Qiao Qiao heard a gloomy voice. Qiao Qiao raised her head in anger. She followed the voice and saw a young man squatting on the wall of Baogua Temple with a long saber on his back. Su Jihu reached out and pulled the maid behind him. "Why are you looking for me?" he asked calmly. The sabersman grinned. "I'm Yuan Tingshan. I don't change my name. I have some grudges with His Royal Highness's brother. Besides, I'm doing things for others. If not, I wouldn't have come to Gangnam-do to make things difficult for a widow like you." Su Jihu's face darkened, but he did not panic. Yuan Tingshan, who had rushed all the way from Mount Hui to Gangnam-do, laughed. "I'll kill all the guards of Lu Mansion outside. Those bald donkeys of Baogua Temple don't know what's good for them, so I'll kill them all and send them to meet Buddha in the Western Paradise. To be honest, only Sword Immortal Tang she can fight with me in Gangnam-do. It's a pity that he went to the capital. Su Jihu, let alone Baogua Temple, even if you were in Lu Mansion, I could still kill my way to you from the gate." Su Jihu sneered. "If you want to kill me, then kill me. Why are you nagging like a woman?" Yuan Tingshan was not angry at all. He stared curiously at the beautiful widow and clicked his tongue. "In the past, when I killed people, I didn't waste my breath with those who were about to die. But you're different. You have an interesting background. It's a pity that I can kill you with a saber." Su Jihu asked, "What do you mean?" Yuan Tingshan tilted his head and stretched out a bleeding arm. "You're not afraid of death. If you're relying on that death warrior from Baelyang's maiden family who secretly protected you, then I might as well tell you that that brother is also dead. It's probably because he hasn't done any big business for many years and is a bit rusty. Otherwise, I'm afraid I would have to wait until later to enter Baogua Temple." "Su Jihu, are you afraid of death now?" Su Jihu smiled sadly and asked, "How are you going to deal with the little girl behind you?" Yuan Tingshan said bluntly, "Naturally, I'll kill her with a saber. I don't have the habit of being gentle with women." Su Jihu turned his head to look. The maid Air Chiao smiled innocently. "Miss, Air Chiao is afraid of pain, but she's not afraid of death." Su Jihu closed his eyes. "Do it." Yuan Tingshan stood up and stood on top of the wall. His face was sinister as he slowly drew his saber. "You dare." Words were accompanied by the clear cry of an ancient sword. There was a sword that came from Mount Wudong 1,000 li away. It landed in front of Su Jihu. A yellow crane arrived at Jiangnan's Lake Ting County. A young Daoist fell like a meteor and instantly arrived at Baogua Temple. Even someone as tenacious as Yuan Tingshan was dumbstruck when he jumped down the wall. A flying sword strangely hung in the air. A young Daoist appeared in front of him. This Daoist's actions were even more outrageous. He looked towards the southeast and said angrily, "Zhao Huang Chao, do you believe that Hong Xixiang will sever your Zhao family's destiny with a single slash?" The ancient sword disappeared in an instant. In front of Mount Longhu, a sword sheath fell from the 9 heavens to the earth. Another ancient sword flew over and coincidentally returned to its sheath. When the ancient sword returned to its sheath, the entire Mount Longhu shook. Then, there was no trace of the immortal. However, an immortal sent a voice transmission. "Zhao Huang Chao, do you believe that Hong Xixiang will sever your Zhao family's destiny with a single slash?" 9 dragon pool destiny lotuses withered in an instant. In the ancestral hall of the Celestial Master Mansion, many ancestral tablets that had been worshipped for hundreds and thousands of years fell to the ground. A middle-aged Daoist from Mount Longhu was furious. He looked at the evil slaying platform. "Hong Xixiang, whether you are the reincarnation of Lu Dongxian or Qi Xianzhu, aren't you afraid of the heavenly tribulation with such heaven-defying actions?" The immortal's voice was like thunder from the 9 heavens. It landed on the evil slaying platform and came from afar. "I have cultivated for 700 years. What can a mere heavenly tribulation do to me? In Baogua Temple, the young Taoist had yet to make a move. Yuan Tingshan was already bleeding from his 7 orifices. He gritted his teeth and broke through the wall with his back. He retreated again and again. The little maid Xiao Er, who was safe and sound, pulled on the sleeve of the woman in front of her. She asked blankly, "Miss, is he an immortal from the heavens?" Su Jihu's eyes were red. He turned his head away. He didn't look at the young martial granduncle who was angry for the first time in his life. Like a little girl, he said in a fit of pique, "What immortal?" "It's a stinky Taoist from Mount Wudong." The young Taoist who rode the crane to Jiangnan said that he didn't even care about the heavenly tribulation. However, at this moment, he revealed an uneasiness that made the maid Xiao Er puzzled. A large yellow crane stopped in the courtyard. It blew down countless osmanthus seeds. Su Jihu, who had turned his head away, asked in a low voice, "What are you doing in Jiangnan?" Xiao Er only saw the Taoist's red face. He wanted to say something but stopped. She thought to herself, "Isn't this immortal Taoist too thin-skinned?" Su Jihu slowly turned his head and asked, "Who are you?" The young Taoist who had been entrusted with high hopes to shoulder the Tao of heaven shyly said, "Hong Shixiang." Su Jihu repeated, "What are you doing here?" The young Taoist gathered his courage and said, "That year on Lotus Peak, you said you wanted to ride a crane." She turned her back to this coward. This Taoist who said he wanted to cut off the fate of the Zhao dynasty took a deep breath and smiled. "Su Jihu, I like you. Whether you believe it or not, I've already liked you for 700 years. So in this world, there's no one who has liked you for longer than me. In my next life, I'll still like you." The maid Xiao Er blinked her watery eyes. Her little brain was a mess. She only saw the mist covering her mouth and crying and laughing. She was even more confused. It seemed that the miss was telling the truth when she said she was young and didn't know anything. The young Taoist stretched out his hand and said softly, "Where do you want to go?" "I'll accompany you." On this day, the young sect leader of Wudong rode a crane to Jiangnan. He and Su Jihu rode the crane away from Jianghu. The immortal rode the crane down to Jiangnan. He had just entered Jianghu when he left Jianghu. Chapter 340. After His Royal Highness and company left the martial emperor city, the strange little worm calculated with his fingers and his face turned pale. He jumped off the horse and rolled on the road with tears and snot. He looked so pitiful, as if the father of the flower thief on the horse had been killed by a righteous person. Su Fingnian had heard from Tsing Yi about Dong Tai's flying sword killing people in the city and the conversation between the peach blossom sword god and little worm. He could vaguely guess the absurd background of this child. The little kid rolled on the ground until he was covered in dust. Finally, he stood in the middle of the road with his hands on his waist, facing the southwest direction. He wiped his snot and tears and cursed, "Damn it. Zhao Huangchao is such a bastard. Why are you fighting with our dragon Tiger Mountain? It's just that the Taoist master mansion didn't let the girl you liked go up the mountain to burn incense. The younger generation is fighting. What are you, an old man who has cultivated for several lifetimes, angry about? Don't think that I won't dare to speak just because you are Ancestor Liu. Of course, I'm trying to reason with you. Don't pick a fight with me. 9 lotuses of luck, 9 lotuses of luck. I only have so little money, and it's all gone because of you. I've been diligent and thrifty all my life. Is it easy? Is it easy?" In the end, the little kid who kept calling himself poor began to sob. His little shoulders trembled. Those who heard him would cry and those who saw him would feel sad. Su Fingnian's face was filled with schadenfreude. He looked at the crowded Donghai from afar and took it as finding joy in misery. He rode his horse to Long Yushuan's side and asked with a smile, "Aren't you going to comfort your son?" Long Yuxuan was so ashamed that he didn't know what to do. His face twitched and cold sweat covered his forehead. What son? The kid was called Old Immortal by the new sword god. It was a great advantage for him to call him his grandfather. The most important thing was whether the child was dead or not. Now that the child turned to Long Yuxuan and called him Dad, Long Yuxuan was also angry. He immediately replied, Ancestor, don't play with the child. Can I call you Ancestor? Little Worm rolled his eyes and said, You are father just because I call you father. Then if I go to the capital and call the Emperor grandson, he is really my grandson. Look at how useless you are. Long Yuxuan almost spat out a mouthful of blood. If it weren't for the fact that he had to hide his identity, he would have dismounted from his horse and hung this little bastard up to give him a good beating. Su Fengnian glanced at the quarrelsome couple and finally fixed his eyes on the little bug's young face. In the past, when he browsed through the Taoist classics, he had seen something like, over 100 years old but still looks like a baby, which was used to describe the miraculous nature of the Taoist immortals. The meeting of the three talents and the formation of the true nascent soul was exactly what the new god of sword Dong Tai had said. Noticing His Royal Highness's gloomy gaze, Little Worm patted his butt and put on the demeanor of an expert. He habitually stroked his beard, but after feeling nothing, he realized that he was still a child after coming out of seclusion. How could he have a beard to pretend to be an expert? He smiled embarrassedly and didn't try to hide his identity. He swaggered to Long Yuxuan's side and climbed back onto his horse. He rode side by side with His Royal Highness and said, I am Zhao Xuanyi from Mount Longhu. Although Su Fengnian was already mentally prepared, he was still shocked when he heard the little pervert's self-introduction. There were 4 Taoist masters in the ancestral court of Taoism. The 2 old Taoist masters, Zhao Shi and Zhao Shituan, were of the Hope generation. Not only were they high and mighty in the genealogy of the Taoist mansion, but they were also among the best in the world. After the Hope generation was Dan, so the brothers Zhao Danxia and Zhao Danping were of the Dan generation, followed by the Jing generation. Other than Zhao Shi and Zhao Shituan, there were also some old Taoist masters of the Hope generation who were in seclusion. However, they were either not the direct descendants of the Taoist mansion or had mediocre abilities. They were far less famous than the 2 old Taoist masters. However, no one outside the mountain had ever heard of the Xian generation, which was 2 generations higher than the Hope generation. 70 years old was already considered the oldest in the world. Su Fengnian estimated that the one in front of him was at least 270 years old. His Royal Highness steered his horse to a high slope, as if he was determined to wait for the old god of swords, Li Chungang. The Longhu's spiritual master, who claimed to be of the Xian generation, frowned and said, You're not leaving. Aren't you afraid that Li Chungang will lose to Wang Xinji again at such a close distance? When that time comes, you'll have to bear the consequences. Dong Tai killed someone in Martial Emperor City and gave him the sword. He obviously put in a lot of effort. Su Fengnian looked at the sea surface and remained silent. The yellow pear sword box with the 12 flying swords was placed on his horse carriage. Su Fengnian did not dare to treat Dong Tai lightly. Dong Tai was famous for his strange words and actions. If this guy dug a hole, Su Fengnian would not be so stupid as to jump in without saying a word and bury himself alive. Back then, when the king of Jing'an, Zhao Heng, gave this King Xianji's knife manual, Su Fengnian was not in a hurry to practice it. He still needed to wait until he returned to Beiliang and had his face appraised by the white fox. He needed to confirm that it was beneficial and harmless before he could practice it. What if he started practicing 1,000 miles in a day and then his tendons and meridians exploded, crippling his martial arts? Who would Su Fengnian complain to then? The battle on the surface of the Yish Sea was thunderous and the rain was heavy. The river and the sea were overturned, and the curtain of swords was endless. The crowd of Martial Emperor City gathered by the sea was dumbfounded. They never thought that martial artists in the world could fight like this. Dozens of Jianghu people who wanted to watch the battle were smashed into pieces by the gang Qi and sword intent. The martial emperor city lord, Wang Xianji, had white hair and a white beard. He was tall and sturdy, standing barefoot on the raging waves with his hands behind his back. He let the 1,800 swords shoot out layer by layer, but they were broken and fell into the sea at a distance of 30 feet away. After 800 flying swords, the distance was only 20 feet. After another 600 swords, they were finally 10 feet away from Wang Xianji. The abundant sword qi and the strong gang qi clashed. Lightning intertwined and crackled, piercing people's eardrums. Another 300 swords pierced the black-robed and white-haired Wang Xianji's body, shattering inch by inch. The spectators thought that after the 1,800 swords failed to kill Wang Xianji, the old man would have exhausted all his skills. Unexpectedly, the old man slowly said, "Sword formed," and the broken swords that fell into the sea all floated to the surface. They gathered in the furnace and formed an unparalleled giant sword between the two men. When the sword was formed, the sky cracked and dazzling golden light slowly sprinkled down. The ordinary-looking old man laughed loudly and said, "Li Chungang, this sword can open the gate of heaven. Can it kill you, Wang Xianji?" Li Chungang opened the gate of heaven with one sword. He went straight to the point. This mountain was Kunlun. The people on the hillside were all in a daze. This was a real immortal on earth. When Xu Xiu, Yang Qingfeng, and even Bluebird couldn't help but look up at the peak battle of Donghai, they heard the screams of horses and the clanging sound of swords being drawn. When they looked back, they saw the horses that Long Yuxuan and Little Chong were riding had been cut in half at the waist. Long Yuxuan, who was excitedly watching the battle, was sitting in a pool of blood with a blank face. He didn't know how the horse could be cut in half at the waist, like a chopstick being pinched by two fingers. What was even more strange was that the young founding master of Dragon Tiger Mountain was standing between the two halves of the horse's corpse with a gloomy face. After His Royal Highness, who had drawn his sword to kill people, was knocked back to Shodong, he even pulled out the winter thunder. Zhao Xuansu, whose appearance didn't match her age and wisdom, smiled faintly and asked, "Su Fengnian, how did you know I was going to attack you?" Chapter 341. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Old Heavenly Master Zhao, after knowing your identity, I was wondering why the old god of swords, Li Chungang, and the new god of swords, Dong Tai, were almost at the same level. Why did Li Chungang only feel that your background was strange, but he couldn't tell that you were at the level of an immortal? It's very simple. Back in the martial emperor city, you already had the intention to kill this young master and leak the traces of your qi circulation. Originally, you wanted to take advantage of Li Chunggang's absence and kill this young master in front of the 6 martial emperor city's martial emperor slaves so that you could shift the blame to Wang Xianji. However, no matter how much you planned, you didn't expect that Deng Tao would also conceal his qi presence and enter the city, exposing your identity. If that was all, I have always respected experts and wouldn't have drawn my sword against you. Since old immortal Zhao went down the mountain and acknowledged Long Yuxuan as his father, I treated him as an otherworldly expert who couldn't be judged by common sense. I felt that the Dragon Tiger Mountain was too boring and wanted to go down the mountain to play. May I ask, old immortal Zhao, did you have the intention to kill me because of the 9 fate lotuses at the withered dragon lake? Did you lose your patience?" Zhao Xuanzu smiled faintly and said, "Everyone outside the mountain says that you're a good-for-nothing with a golden exterior. After seeing it with my own eyes, I really feel indignant for the young prince." Su Fengnian didn't hide anything and squinted his eyes. Old immortal Zhao might not know, but before I came to the Dragon Tiger Mountain, I had interacted with Zhao Huangqiao at the Kuanglu Mountain. Just now, old immortal Zhao revealed his true feelings and spoke from the bottom of his heart. Others might not know the severity of it, but I was sweating profusely. To be honest, Zhao Xuanzu smiled. Zhao Xuanzu smiled and stretched out her arm. Her chi-dissolving mystery sucked her cheapskate father, who looked as if he was facing a great enemy, into her tender palm. With a bang, his entire body exploded like a snowball, and his corpse fell to the ground. It was even more unsightly than the dismembered horse. The Taoist priest, who fit the description of a 1,000-year-old tortoise, only stared at His Royal Highness. He did not even look at Long Yuxuan, who died with his eyes wide open. He only sighed softly. Life is unpredictable. Fortune and misfortune depend on each other. Su Fengnian was similarly not shocked in the slightest. He didn't even turn his head to look at the flower thief who had just become a guest of Bailiang before suddenly dying in a foreign land. He didn't even bother to wipe away the blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. He looked down at the old ancestor of Mount Longhu and asked curiously, "I was only lucky enough to guess that old Immortal was going to make a move. As for why you wanted to kill me, I still don't quite understand. I hope old Immortal can enlighten me." Zhao Xuanzu stretched out his hands and pressed down. Xu Qian and Yang Qingfeng, along with their horses, were instantly pressed to the ground by a heavy weight. The two horses were crushed into meat paste. The two northern Liang retainers struggled to hold on, bleeding from their 7 orifices. Against this ancestor of Mount Longhu, they actually had no strength to fight back. The Taoist priest glanced at the surface of the eastern sea and chuckled, "It's okay if you want to delay time. I'm also waiting for the divine gate to open." Li Chungang, you're indeed the best swordsman in the 500 years after ancestor Liu. Xu Xiu, who was on the verge of death, spat out blood. She lay on the ground and struggled, "Your Highness, save me." Su Fengnian turned a deaf ear to her and laughed, "Why? Old Immortal has such a mysterious supernatural power. Are you still afraid of the illusory fate that entangles you and prevents you from ascending?" The Taoist priest sighed. "How can I not be afraid? Since things have come to this, I'll make it clear to you. I, Zhao Xuanzu, am only one step away from ascending to immortality. It was so before 60 years, but it's still so after 60 years. Just like how I killed Long Yuxuan just now, fortune and misfortune are intertwined." The Taoist priest's residence, Zhao family, shares the same surname as the Son of Heaven, Zhao family. 500 years of karma entangled with each other, just like how the black tortoise totem entangled with a snake. Their fates have long been mixed up. When I entered the martial emperor's city and met Dong Tai, my killing intent had faded. When your fate was strong and you weren't destined to die, I was happy to be a coward and hide in Mount Longhu. Unfortunately, when I got here, Li Chungang opened the divine gate with his sword. Even if I killed you, I could take the opportunity to ascend. Look, that's the divine gate. I once made a bet with Zhao Huangchao that whoever ascended first would lose a seal. Once I ascended today, my fate would be retribution. If that old bastard dares to take the seal, he would have to find Zhao Huangchao. As for you, Su Fengnian, you died in front of Wang Xinji. Zhao family's imperial court borrowed Su Zhao's butcher's knife to cut off the rotten meat of Martial Emperor City. Evil people will be dealt with by evil people. It's my compensation to my century-old friend, Zhao Huangchao. Su Fengnian praised, "Old Immortal, you have a good plan." Zhao Xuanzu laughed, "I've lived for a long time. My Tao is ordinary, but I'm thick-skinned." The Taoist priest laughed, "I advise you not to expect the two land immortals to notice the abnormality here. I still have the ability to do so." An instant spear curved like a crescent moon and swept down from the sky. Zhao Xuanzu did not move and allowed the instant spear to hit the young body. However, the next scene was Blue Bird vomiting blood and flying backward. The Taoist priest said regretfully, "Little girl, it's a pity for your body." Then, he looked at His Royal Highness and seemed to be mocking, "You can still keep your composure." Blue Bird stood up shakily, but the instant spear did not leave her hand. Su Fengnian glanced at Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng who were struggling. He waved his hand to stop Blue Bird, who was trying to fight to the death with the Taoist priest, and asked, "Everyone here has to die?" Zhao Xuanzu nodded. Su Fengnian chuckled and said, "Then let me go first." Zhao Xuanzu did not say any nonsense. He instantly shrank the ground and swept in front of Su Fengnian. He did not give him any chance to draw his knife and block. His move was a killer move. Ta! Just as he was about to touch His Royal Highness, a hand blade strangely pierced towards him. Even Zhao Xuanzu, who had a high realm, was repelled by this mysterious move. He looked down and saw a scarlet blood groove on his neck. He looked up and saw a girl with an old-fashioned smile. Zhao Xuanzu frowned. He saw that the sword in the distance had opened the gate of heaven and opened the line between the sea and the sky. It was clearly the best time. He twisted his neck and his body made continuous cracking sounds. It was like a string of soybeans exploding. Zhao Xuanzu sneered, "Not bad, not bad. His Royal Highness has some skills. He actually forced me to summon my real body." The Taoist priest's bones, flesh, and blood began to grow like an old tree in spring. Su Fengnian said calmly, "So that's what they say. You are really not a master. Not to mention the old god of swords Li Chungang, even the new god of swords Dong Tai is far from you." Zhao Xuanzu was furious. He looked up to the sky and laughed. "Nephew, your flattery is just a so-so." A unique mellow voice came from the bottom of the hill. "I gave you the sword first and repaid half of your kindness. After killing you, I repaid the other half. I saved you twice. From today onwards, Dong Tai and your mother, Wu Su, no longer owe each other. You are not a master if you don't show off." How is he not a master? He obviously lived his whole life as a dog. Dong Tai is here to kill the dog. Since Senior Li's sword was formed in the Eastern Sea, Dong Tai will not make a fool of himself. Sword, rise. Zhao Xuanzu showed a panicked expression for the first time. He said angrily, "Dong Tai, how did you know this place changed?" Dong Tai raised the sword. How would the world know it reached the peak? Dong Tai, who was standing 10 feet away, spread out his hands and smiled, "Ame, Zhu Ke, Huang Tong. Tai Tai, Jin Lu. Tai Ah." 6 small swords broke out of the box. They were nailed to the top of Zhao Xuanzu's head, temples, and 3 dantians. The Taoists said that the Immortal could level the earth and shatter the mountains and rivers. "Why don't you let me see it?" His body collapsed. Zhao Xuanzu forced his primordial spirit to leave his body. Like a rainbow, he flew towards the heavenly gate. Dong Tai took a step forward. He said calmly, "You want to become an immortal? You have to ask Dong Tai's sword first. Come back." The 6 flying swords were clearly nailed to Zhao Xuanzu's body. However, the primordial spirit of the Taoist reflected the outline of the 6 swords. The primordial spirit was pulled back into the body. Su Fengnian did not say anything. He cut the primordial spirit in half and laughed, "I will let you become an immortal." Chapter 342. Seeing that the body of the elder ancestor of Dragon Tiger Mountain, which had returned to its original state, was split open by Su Fengnian's saber, Shu Xiong, who was lying on the ground, had a gleeful and ferocious look in his eyes. In the past, when he was living under someone else's roof in the northern Liang mansion, he had done a lot of dirty business involving human lives. There were also several dangerous situations where his life was hanging by a thread, but it had never been as futile as today. Facing Zhao Xuanzu, who had been showing the appearance of a child all the way to Martial Emperor City, he could not even touch half an inch of his sleeve before he was suffocated by Zhao Xuanzu's majestic qi, bleeding from his 7 orifices. Seeing His Royal Highness succeed in one strike with the help of Dong Tai's divine sword skill, she felt so comfortable that she could not wait to marry this young crown prince on the spot. She was well aware that if Su Fengnian had not spoken, her and Yang Qingfeng's qi would have exploded together with their flesh and blood. Xu Xiu could not be as open-minded as Lu Qiantang, who had died in the common reed marsh. She had just escaped from the gloomy prison in Beiliang and even had the chance to replace Pei Nanwei as the fake princess of Jing and Palace. How could she be willing to die here? Xu Xiu silently recited the Heart Sutras and smoothed her qi. Her whole body was in so much pain that it penetrated her heart. Inevitably, her beautiful and charming face was distorted. However, as soon as one wave subsided, another wave arose. Before Xu Xiu could criticize Xiao Xuanzu's unsightly death, she saw the 6 flying swords of the peach blossom sword deity buzzing like cicadas. The out-of-body primordial spirit, which had failed to reach the gate of heaven, was still condensed and did not disperse after losing its physical body. Instead, it seemed to have been freed from its shackles and was floating in the air. Dressed in a yellow and purple Taoist robe with wide sleeves, it looked like a celestial being with a celestial demeanor. Xu Xiu looked up in a daze at the rootless primordial spirit that seemed to be free and unfettered in heaven and earth. An overwhelming sense of fear surged over her. Xu Xiu turned her head with difficulty and looked at Dong Tai standing in the distance. The truth of the 12 flying swords that came out of the box in 2 batches had already been revealed. Black armor, childhood sweetheart, morning dew, spring water, peach blossom, moth eyebrows, vermilion bird, Huang Tong, Wei Yu, and Tai Ah. Clearly, in Xu Xiu's opinion, the one who could fight against the great Jinren of Longhu Mountain, Xiao Xuanzu, was not the overly young His Royal Highness. It could only be this renowned new peach blossom sword god. After Xu Xiu caught her breath, she immediately struggled to get up. Without caring about her bearing, she stuck out her perky buttocks, bent over, and staggered backwards. Young Qingfeng, on the other hand, was not afraid of death. She sat cross-legged where she was and quietly adjusted her breathing. Su Fengnian held his blade and slowly retreated. He squinted his eyes and looked at Xiao Xuanzu, who was similar to the middle-aged Taoist at the peak of Kuanglu Mountain. He sneered, "A centipede dies but does not fall down. Each one of the old Taoists is more greedy than the other." Xiao Xuanzu, who was not allowed to enter the heavenly gate, turned around and looked at the golden light spilling over the surface of the sea. His expression was complicated. The 6 short swords were still inserted in the 6 major acupoints. They were like gangrene attached to the bones. When the flying swords entered the primordial spirit, a sizzling sound was heard as if hot water was poured over ice and snow. However, Xiao Xuanzu did not feel it at all. The flying swords that Dong Tai carried with him were naturally not ordinary weapons. Otherwise, they would not be able to hurt the yuanying of a Jinren who was on an astral journey. Although the swords were small, the heroic spirit contained in the swords was bottomless. The people of the world thought that slaying demons and demons was a trick that Taoism deliberately mystified. In fact, this was not the case. Therefore, when the martial artists of Jianghu reached the state of perfection, it was also within the law and principle that they use celestial beings to test their swords. Dong Tai always had an indifferent and gentle appearance. He did not have the consciousness of confronting a land immortal at all. He smiled and asked, "Dong Tai has never been to Mount Longhu before. I don't know if these 6 swords are too light or too heavy a gift for you. I feel very uneasy." Although they were in a dangerous situation, Su Fengnian could not help but laugh. This Dong Tai was indeed a strange and wonderful person. First, he called Xiao Xuanzu an old dog. Now, he was pretending to be polite. However, there was no respect in his words. It was really a slap in the face. Su Fengnian then sighed with emotion. If Dong Tai did not have this sword manipulation mystery, how could he be so calm? Weren't people like Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng suppressed by Xiao Xuanzu before they could even say a word? Not to mention Long Yuxuan, whose life was full of misfortunes. After being a father for a few days, he was turned into powder by his son who turned against him. This Mount Longhu was indeed very different from Mount Wudong. The old chief, Wang Zhonglo, did not have the slightest arrogance of a Taoist leader. The few times they met, he was kind and amiable. It was not only because he was the heir of Beiliang. In such a large Taoist ancestral court, only Zhao Shituan could be considered a good person. No wonder this sloppy old Taoist was depressed. It was because prime ministers like Zhao Danping had stolen the high position and were like the sun in the sky. Thinking of this, Su Fengnian glanced at the assassin in front of him. The young lady chuckled. For the sake of 1,000 taels of gold, was this young lady of mysterious origins really willing to be so greedy that she wouldn't come out? She did not even care about her own life. First, it was the 11th in the world, Wang Mingyin. Now, it was the great spiritual master, Zhao Xuanzu. What was she planning? Was she going to kill or save? Jia Jia Jia. The three characters of the name were all homophonic. Su Fengnian had once sent a secret letter to Su Xiao, asking if she had planted a death warrior by his side. This was a major matter that involved Su Fengnian's life and death. Su Xiao had personally written a letter stating that this girl was not the #1 death warrior in the palace. As a result, Su Fengnian was even more confused. What was in this girl's little head? Who would believe that she was purely a little money grubber? As for the fact that he did not disperse Zhao Xuanzu's spirit with one strike, Su Fengnian was definitely disappointed. However, he was not surprised. The methods of celestials were originally mysterious and unpredictable. The two on the surface of the East Sea had moved mountains and drained seas to open the gate of heaven. Each of them had displayed their magical powers. How shocking! Although Zhao Xuanzu was definitely inferior to Wang Xianji and Li Chungang in terms of martial arts, it would be too degrading to say that she was killed by His Royal Highness with one strike. After all, he was an old Taoist who had cultivated for a few lifetimes on Mount Longhu. Zhao Xuanzu knew the Jianghu without going out, and knew the world without going down the mountain. Untainted by the mortal world, he gently flicked his sleeves and flicked the two flying swords named Moth May and Vermilion Bird out of the two major acupoints. The flying swords were not broken. After being forced out, they flew around the old Taoist. Zhao Xuanzu ignored them and laughed softly. I heard that Dong Tai's swordsmanship is 2 realms higher than his peers. It's close to Lu Zu's sword art. Today, I was fortunate enough to experience it personally. However, it's impolite not to reciprocate. I also have some insignificant skills that I would like to learn from Sword God Dang. Dong Tai asked, Old Taoist Master, since you have no hope of becoming an immortal in this life and your body has been destroyed, why don't you go with the flow and find a good family to reincarnate while your vital spirit is still gathered? As he spoke, Zhao Xuanzu flicked his sleeves again and forced the golden strands of the sword out of his acupoint. He stroked his beard and said, When I was young, I swore that I would not attain the great way and seek a place in the heavenly court. If I die, so be it. I don't care about the 9 kinds of corpses of Taoism. Dong Tai was also in a leisurely mood. He did not beat a drowning dog like the common people. Instead, he asked calmly, Taoism's prophecy is said to be able to predict good and bad luck. It can predict the wind and rain of the next 500 years. Can't it predict one's own life? Su Fengnian watched as the old Taoist flicked his sleeves for the 3rd time and sent the 2 flying swords into the air. Only the small Taya sword was left. Zhao Xuanzu shook his head and said in a low voice, The heavenly way is like a carriage. It moves as fast as lightning. There are moths circling leisurely in it. Why doesn't this moth hit the wall of the carriage? Dong Tai said with a face full of emotions, How can one be free in the heavenly way? If one can't step out of Kunlun, one can't live for more than 100 years. Chapter 343. Su Fengnian was baffled and did not feel enlightened. He only knew that the 2 masters were ready to attack. To be precise, Dong Tai was confident to the point of conceit, allowing Zhao Xuanzu to escape from the six swords prohibition. In the carriage, Murong Tonghuang lifted the curtain to watch the battle. Murong Wuzhu was timid and did not dare to look. She shrank in the corner and shivered. Suddenly, she widened her eyes. She saw the yellow pearwood box rise slowly and shake violently. The sword box opened and the six exquisite swords flew out. Dong Tai waited until the small swords that shared the same fate as him flew into the air. He said softly, "I don't think about the way of heaven, but ever since I started practicing, I have never doubted the sword in my hand." Everyone only saw Dong Tai, who was unparalleled in the art of killing, smiling as he stretched out his finger and flicked it. 12 small swords lined up in a straight line in front of him, as if they were going to draw a gap between heaven and earth. The heaven and earth changed color and its momentum was not inferior to the surface of the East Sea. 60 moments in a flick of the finger and 900 deaths in an instant. This was the essence of the finger mystery. Therefore, Wang Xianji once said that in the world, only the white-robed monk Li Dongxin had obtained the essence of the Vajra realm. Qiao Chongqing took 8 portions of the celestial phenomenon spirit, and Dong Tai won the first finger mystery. There were 4 realms in the first stage, but it did not mean that the level of martial arts attainment was higher or lower. Especially for the saints of the 3 sects who had the advantage of time, place, and people. Even if they entered the Earth Immortal realm, they might not be a match for the loose immortals outside the 3 sects in a battle of life and death. Moreover, the 3 sects had always valued the way of heaven and despised martial arts. Even the supernatural power of Lu Zu's flying sword was regarded as a strange skill that was incompatible with the way of heaven. It could be seen that the saints of the 3 sects did not value martial arts. Dong Tai smiled and said, "The sword formation is called the weapon release. I originally prepared it for Wang Xianji. It is a pity that I used it on you." Zhao Xuanzu squinted and said, "What a great thunder pool. I dare to cross it and see if Sword God Deng can use the weapon release." The ancestor of the Dragon Tiger Mountain crossed it. The sword formation was like a rainbow. The out-of-body primordial spirit was instantly shredded into nothingness. In a flash, Dong Tai angrily said, "Old dog Zhao, how dare you be so opportunistic?" Dong Tai came behind His Royal Highness, grabbed him by the collar and was about to throw Su Fingnian back. However, the new god of swords was alert and quick enough, but he still could not resist a torrent of purple gas pouring down in front of Su Fingnian. He could vaguely hear Zhao Xian's last words on the eve of his death, "Since I can't cut off the fate, I'll use a trick and steal a heavenly secret. I'll pass the calamity of Mount Longhu on to you." Purple Qi from the east. Although the sword formation had destroyed most of it, about 20 to 30% of it still flowed into Su Fingnian's body. It was the first time that Dong Tai showed such an angry expression. The world was silent as he shouted, "Zhao Xuanzu, I want your mansion of Taoist master to have no descendants." The Sanqing purple qi was vast and mighty, lingering around Su Fingnian's body. The calamity was imminent. Dong Tai was extremely annoyed. He was familiar with many unorthodox methods of Taoism, and this Zhao Xuanzu obviously wanted to use his life to kill Su Fingnian and destroy his fate. Although Dong Tai thought that he rarely met a worthy opponent, karma and fate were the most unpredictable things in this world. His karma with Su Fingnian was very shallow. In fact, after the death of his consort Wu Su, all that was left was a verbal promise from a young swordsman. He had already paid it back by using his sword twice inside and outside the Eastern Sea Martial Emperor city. In a flash, the purple gas and Su Fingnian were very harmonious. No matter how powerful Dong Tai was, he could not cut off the qi dynamic. Even if he took a step back, he was willing to bear this calamity, but he was powerless to absorb the fate. This was also the reason why Dong Tai hated Zhao Xuanzu the most. As a Taoist spiritual master, he was actually so vicious. The girl turned around and stared blankly at Su Fingnian, whose red date between his eyebrows had turned from purple to black. She smiled, but she was not gloating. Instead, she looked a little sad. Perhaps even Huang Sanzhou would be shocked if he saw this unfamiliar emotion. She tiptoed and reached out to touch His Royal Highness's black glabella. Even Dong Tai was stunned, but he did not stop her in the end. Beiliang was cold and bitter. That year, it was snowing. A little girl knelt by the roadside and sold her body to bury her mother. She was born at the bottom of the market. Her father was addicted to gambling. They used to be a small family, but after a few years, he lost all his fortune. After his daughter was born, he swore to his wife that he would never gamble again. He even chopped off one of his fingers, but he still could not stop his addiction to gambling. For as long as the child could remember, she saw her father threaten to sell her and threaten her mother to become a prostitute. He drank and scolded the mother and daughter without restraint. That was his greatest achievement. As the child grew up in poverty, her mother's face gradually withered and she earned less money. The girl could never forget those vulgar men who walked out of the leaky thatched house with their waistbands and threw a dozen copper coins to her father. That man bent over to receive the money with a flattering smile. Later, when her mother knew that the man was determined to sell her daughter, she, who was terminally ill, changed into the last set of plain clothes she had. She sent her daughter away to pick some wild vegetables and cooked a pot of rice porridge with arsenic. When the girl returned home, the man who had not called her father since he was sensible was already cold. The small pot of porridge only had 6 bowls. He only cared about himself and drank 5 bowls in one breath. Naturally, he died quickly. The woman who only drank 1 bowl of porridge hugged her daughter before she died. She bled and cried, unable to speak. The little girl, whose fingers were bleeding from frostbite, washed her mother's face and put her on the straw mat. She didn't look at the man and went to Liangzhou City, kneeling beside the straw mat. This scene was not strange in the winter of Beiliang, so she didn't need to write anything on the charcoal, nor did she need to cry and complain. But who would be willing to do such an unlucky thing that would cost a lot of money for a filthy little girl in thin clothes? The road was full of beautiful women in mink fur. No one would take a second look at the little girl who might not be able to survive the harsh winter. A few ruffians who had taken money from her family passed by and kicked away the straw mat, revealing the body of the little girl's mother. She was lying on her mother's body. They said that her mother was a dirty woman and that they should just throw her body out in the wild. She cried and said that her mother was not dirty at all, so they stepped on the body. The little girl bit one of the ruffian's legs, but she was pulled up by the hair and punched in the stomach. He asked her if she was dirty or not. Every time she said no, every time she shook her head, she was punched. How old was she at that time? How many punches could she take? But the passers-by were indifferent and no one cared about this. Many people were bored and watched with great interest. Later, a luxurious carriage passed by. Probably because he heard the noise, a young man in a luxurious white coat got off the carriage and came to her side. Next to him stood a beautiful woman who covered her nose with her eyes full of disgust. He asked her who was prettier, her mother or the woman next to her. The little girl, whose mouth was bleeding, gave an answer that made the onlookers burst into laughter. The seductive woman who accompanied the young man was embarrassed, and her eyes were full of anger and coldness. The young man, whose absurd reputation had spread all over Beiliang, didn't show any expression. He took a pearl hairpin from the head of the woman next to him. There was a huge pearl hanging at the end of the hairpin. The little girl didn't know that a pearl was worth 1,000 gold. She only saw the man squat down and put the hairpin on her mother's head, asking her if it was pretty. The little girl cried and said yes. He patted her head and chuckled, but didn't say anything. He returned to the carriage and left. After that, someone immediately buried her mother. That winter day, the little girl knelt at the grave and met Huang Longshi. In these years, other than killing people, her only hobby was collecting hairpins. This year, outside Xiangfan City, she killed that so-called 11th in the world. Whoever wanted that young man to die, she wanted him dead. She didn't care if he was a first-rank master or an immortal on Earth. To her, this was the only reason. Chapter 344. Killing a man in 10 steps, leaving no trace for 1,000 miles. When the deed is done, I leave with a flick of my sleeve, hiding my identity and name. The essence of this popular paladin poem was the word kill. If it was changed to save, it would obviously be neither fish nor fowl. At this moment, His Royal Highness, who was sitting sickly in the carriage, was in a very strange mood. His aunt, Jia, who kept a big cat as a pet, originally thought that even if it was not because of national enmity, she was a cold-blooded and ruthless first-class assassin who would not lend a helping hand. Zhao Xuanzu's 3 Pure Tribulations. A few days ago, at the top of the Donghai slope, Su Fengnian's body was like an alchemy furnace, boiling abnormally. Unlike the external elixir that used gold, stone, and medicinal herbs as bait, the inner elixir melted one's essence, qi, and spirit. The danger within was not inferior to Taoist Zhao's killing move. Zhao Xuanzu's purple qi from the east and Su Fengnian's big yellow courtyard were like weapons of war. Su Fengnian fell into a coma and was on the verge of death. When he woke up, he found out from Blue Bird that it was Jia who saved his life and caused the purple qi to flow into her body. Then she left without leaving a word. The Peach Blossom Sword deity asked Blue Bird to leave a message for his distant nephew, saying that he had removed the prohibition of the 12 swords and needed a new master to feed him with blood. The shortest was 3 years, the longest was 10 years. As long as he had enough qi and learned a superior sword-controlling technique, he would be able to control the 12 swords. Back then, he owed the Su family or Wuxia a life-saving debt. Even if he did not owe them anything, he would not meet them in the future. Old Manly opened the curtain and bent over to enter the carriage. He sat down lazily against the wall. Su Fengnian glanced at him. How the Battle of Donghai ended. He only heard that it was a draw, but no one could see any clues. Wang Xianji opened the sea to send the old sword deity off, giving him enough face. Obviously, old monster Wang, who had stood at the peak of martial arts for 60 years, had never forgotten the kindness of half a wooden bowl. This made Su Fengnian have a good impression of the martial emperor Castellan. The old god of swords saw a yellow pearwood box on the cotton blanket with a picture of 100 birds paying homage to the phoenix. He opened the sword box without a trace of politeness. Despite the dense sword aura, the old man with the sheepskin fur coat said, "Sissy, embroidery needle. Is this junior surnamed Deng a woman?" Su Fengnian, whose injuries had spread from the inside out, was pale. His knees were covered with a small satin blanket made by Shishu. In addition, there was a new charcoal stove in the carriage. It was not winter yet, which showed how weak His Royal Highness was. He smiled bitterly and said, "Fortunately, Dong Tai was not present. Otherwise, you would have to fight." Li Chungang reached out to take off his boots and buckled his feet. He blew his beard and glared. What? This old man can't beat Wang Xianji, but he can't beat Dong Tai. Su Fengnian raised his eyebrows and asked carefully, "You lost at Donghai." Li Chungang pursed his lips and said straightforwardly, "This old man has lost, so what's there to hide?" Wang Xianji's realm has fallen in recent years, but his cultivation has been steadily rising. His foundation is solid, and his comprehension is good. It's not strange that he can't beat Wang Xianji. However, in that fight, Wang Xianji had used 90% of his strength. If he had fought with all his strength, perhaps only Ancestor Lu from 500 years ago would have been able to suppress this ignorant man. This old man is still a bit lacking. It's a pity that you didn't see the scene of him raising the water of Donghai. It's very frightening. Ignoring the shock in His Royal Highness' heart, the old god of swords looked at the sword box again. This time, he didn't speak harshly. He sighed softly and said, "These 12 pocket-sized flying swords have their seals removed. They're almost considered half-dead objects. It's not easy for them to have such sword intent. In terms of sword nurturing and flying swords, Dong Tai is indeed the #1 in the world. He's worthy of being the sword genius who made the Wu family's sword tomb lose face." However, calling him a childhood sweetheart is really making this old man's teeth sour. It's a far cry from wooden horse ox. The battle between sword techniques and Taoist technique seems like water and fire, but when techniques reach the peak, they're no different from Taoism. Dong Tai is a smart person. He's like Wang Xianji who uses strength to prove Taoism. Only this kind of Jianghu is interesting. Su Fengnian's expression was strange. The old man wearing the sheepskin coat felt comfortable and reached out to close the sword box again. Su Fengnian felt a headache coming on. Fortunately, the person in front of him was Li Chungang. Otherwise, he could treat the sword box as a gift from Dong Tai in such a way. If it were an ordinary hero of Jianghu, he wouldn't be able to worship this small box. Li Chungang probably saw His Royal Highness's gaze and said unhappily, "Have you ever heard that the cold people need warmth? Don't take people's clothes and make them into lichens." No matter how ignorant and incompetent Su Fengnian was, the poem was easy to understand and he could clearly hear the sarcasm in it. He lowered his head and saw the expensive blanket, which was worth an inch of gold. He was stunned and mocked himself, "Senior, you worry about the country and the people. You are indeed a great master." Chapter 345. The old man wearing the sheepskin fur coat was indifferent to this kid's flattery. He picked his earwax and clicked his tongue. "I heard that Zhao Xuanzu didn't hesitate to risk his old life to frame you for the calamity of Mount Longhu. It's fine if the young assassin who killed Wang Mingyin didn't take advantage of the situation, but she even helped you. King of Jing'an and Zhao Heng's 1,000 taels of gold were all wasted." This old man couldn't understand this matter no matter how much he thought about it. To say that you're unlucky is indeed extremely unlucky. You've provoked Zhao Xuanzu, a celestial master who hasn't appeared in 100 years. But to say that you're lucky is also not wrong. You were clearly facing a great calamity, but you were still able to turn the tables. By accident, the 3 pure purple clouds opened your acupuncture points. How many floors are you in the Great Yellow Hall? When you recover from your injuries, won't you be able to touch the threshold of the Vajra physique? It's true that riches come from danger. This old man Zhao Xuanzu is really a good-for-nothing. He doesn't have the ability to challenge Su Shao and Beiliang's 300,000 strong cavalry. He only knows how to find trouble with you, a junior. It's said that a small temple is big, but in this old man's opinion, Mount Longhu is full of bastards. He went for wool and came home shorn. Now that he's provoked Dong Tai, the celestial master's residence won't be peaceful. Su Fengnian covered his stinging chest, gritted his teeth, and sneered. This stinky old Taoist was stopped by Dong Tai. He couldn't kill me, so he took advantage of the opportunity when you opened the gate of heaven and wanted to leave his body and ascend. In the end, he was still intercepted by Dong Tai's flying sword. I had no choice but to burn both jade and common stone. Originally, I didn't haggle with Mount Longhu last time because Zhao Shituan accepted Huang Manor as his disciple. Sure enough, kind people are bullied. No matter how Dong Tai acts, the next time I climb Mount Longhu, I'll definitely let this group of noble people suffer. Li Chungang sneered and said, "With your little cultivation. Do you really think you're like Dong Tai or Chao Chongqing?" Su Fengnian smiled calmly and said, "I'm young. In addition, with the guidance of the old senior, I'll be able to achieve twice the results with half the effort. There will be a day when I can take my revenge and vent my anger." Li Chungang stretched out a finger and tapped the sword box. He chanted the word "rise," and the box slid open. The 12 flying swords floated in the air and lined up in a line. It was exactly the same as Dong Tai's formation. He ignored Su Fengnian's surprise and said, "The path of sword intent has reached the peak. The turbulent river flows to the east sea and the rolling thunder strikes the heavenly court. It seems to be too overbearing and without any rules. But in the end, it is still going along the path and there are rules to follow." Formula Dao and Formula Dao were both indispensable. For example, if a person traveled a long distance, technique was the strength of the feet and Dao was the path. If one only had the strength of the feet, going astray was just drawing a circle around the ground and not going far. If one only knew the direction but did not walk, it was nothing more than looking at plums to quench one's thirst. Dong Tai is still too stingy. He only gave you the 12 flying swords but did not leave behind the sword riding method. Instead of giving a man a fish, teaching a man to fish is better than teaching a man to fish. This old man showed the two-sleeved green snake no less than 100 times. If you really memorized it, it would be a superior sword riding method. One day, you would be able to break through the bottleneck and use the big yellow cord in your body to kill people with flying swords. The ancients said that after reading 10,000 books, one would be able to write like a god. This was also the reason why this old man wanted little Jiang to practice calligraphy and not swordsmanship. How is calligraphy not swordsmanship? It's not that this old man is boasting, but the two-sleeved green snake is the pinnacle of swordsmanship in the Jianghu for 100 years. It's equivalent to spreading the 10,000 books on your desk. As for how much you can understand, it depends on your luck. This old man can't teach you swordsmanship like a child walking. Firstly, it's too degrading. Secondly, it's just pulling up seedlings to help them grow. It's not beneficial at all. The 12 flying swords trembled at a speed almost invisible to the naked eye. Descend. The flying swords slowly descended and lay quietly in the sword case. In the face of the old god of swords Li Chuangong's unprecedented sigh, Su Fengnian softly called him old senior, and did not say anything else. The one-armed Li Chungang lifted the curtain and looked at the scenery outside the window. He smiled and said, "As you guessed, after this old man's battle with Wang Xianji, he has no regrets about swordsmanship or life. This old man has no children. He's an old man with no one to rely on. He has no attachments. What he said today is true even if he's about to die. In this life, he was once young and frivolous. He used his sword to cut down injustice. But the world is so big. How can this old man settle it with his sword alone? I remember that a long time ago, there was a female poet who praised this old man for destroying the 5 great mountains with his sword. This old man disdained to take responsibility for it. But now that I think about it carefully, there's some truth to it." For a moment, Su Fengnian had mixed feelings and was speechless. Logically speaking, Li Chungang should have been the undisputed champion of swordsmanship after returning to the realm of swordsmanship and fighting with Wang Xianji. At the very least, he could be on par with Dong Tai. He was one of the top 3 martial arts grandmasters in the world. It was time for him to rise up and make the new Jianghu look at him in a new light. But now, the old man wearing the sheepskin coat was calm and relaxed. He had the intention to completely withdraw from the Jianghu. It was not because he was disheartened, but because he had no attachments and no more requests. He truly had the strength of an immortal. Li Chungang put down the curtain and said softly, "After I send you back to Beiliang, I'll go see Miss Jiang one last time and teach her everything I've learned. Do you have anything you want this old man to tell you?" Su Fengnian shook his head. Li Chungang was not a narrow-minded person who was obsessed with love, so he did not continue on this topic. Suddenly, he said to himself with a smile, "I wonder who will be able to subdue the old monster Wang Xianji in the future." Su Fengnian asked tentatively, "How's the face of White Fox who came out of the tower after reaching the top? How's the Huang man who entered the finger mystery?" The old man wearing the sheepskin coat thought for a moment and said, "That white fox's face is still far from being as good as the one who came out of the tower. But if he is given some opportunities and fights with a few of the top 10 masters for 10 or 20 years, then he can go to the martial emperor's city and have a wonderful fight. As for your brother, hey, he's the second Wang Xinji. There's no need for him to fight." Su Fingnian was in a good mood. Su Fingnian lifted the curtain and saw the beautiful scenery outside. There was a green mountain in front of them with green bamboos as far as the eye could see. He asked Blue Bird to stop and got off the carriage to take a walk, feeling relaxed and happy. This was the first time Pei Nanwei and the Murong siblings had seen His Royal Highness recently. In addition, the scenery in the distance was very beautiful, so they all got off the carriage to enjoy the scenery. Xu Xiu looked at the young crown prince who was seriously injured and somewhat dispirited. She did not know why, but after the white horse left Liangzhou, it had been nurturing something. Until outside the martial emperor's city, the man who had experienced the great calamity finally transformed. Xu Xiu stared at the back of the figure in a daze. For a moment, she was a little dazed. Chapter 346. As they ascended the mountain, green bamboo lined the path, and a cool breeze blew. Qing now draped a fox fur coat over Su Fingnian, which was out of season. Su Fingnian was tall and slender, and his skin was excellent. As a result, it added a lot of otherworldly aura to this young master, making him look like a wild fox. Princess Jing and Pei Nanwei and the Murong siblings followed closely behind. The old god of swords Li Chungang stayed at the foot of the mountain to guard the carriage, so he did not follow them. This allowed Xu Xiu to leave her post to guard the carriage for once. While admiring the sea of bamboo, she quietly observed the back of that figure from a close distance. When Pei Nanwei saw a small lake as clear as a mirror halfway up the mountain, she was quite amazed. Especially when she saw that there was a house built in the middle of the lake. On the lakeside, there was a delicate bamboo raft made of nanju. The green bamboos reflected the scenery and the sound of the bamboo rustling in the wind. It was like a fairyland. Su Fingnian did not intend to disturb the owner of the bamboo house in the middle of the lake. He walked straight to the beautiful and graceful bamboo by the lakeside. With a gentle tap of his toes, the bamboo would rather break than bend. It had always been compared by scholars to have a strong moral integrity. At this moment, under Su Fingnian's feet, the bamboo bent meekly and extended toward the lake in a subtle arc. When Su Fingnian stopped, the bamboo was still more than 2 zhang above the lake. Su Fingnian suddenly thought of Wang Chushua's words. Was it the sound of the people's suffering last night when the rain knocked on the bamboo? He wondered if this little girl, who had just experienced her first awakening of love, was doing well recently. He stood on the bamboo and looked into the distance. Smoke rose from the bamboo house in the center of the lake. After he left the martial emperor's city and woke up, he received a secret letter from Chu Lushan. When Su Fingnian heard that the bull-riding fellow had finally left the mountain, he had already amazed the world with a single brilliant feat. He rode a crane to Jiangnan and rescued eldest sister from Yuan Tingshan's clutches. Not to mention, he even rode Ancestor Lu's sword and flew to Mount Longhu. He was thousands of li away from Zhao Huangchao and left behind a few words. 9 of the dragon pawn's lotus of fortune had withered, which shook the world. He could not be more immortal. Su Fingnian also did not know what relationship this fellow had with Ancestor Lu, Qi Xuanjin. To His Highness the Crown Prince, as long as this coward was wholeheartedly devoted to eldest sister and was liked by eldest sister, so what if you, Hong Shixiang, were just a nameless road sweeper on Mount Wudong? The Su family dominated Beiliang, swallowing tens of thousands of li. 300,000 cavalrymen faced off against the huge Beimang dynasty. They naturally had the courage to match their family background. After receiving this shocking news that was said to be discussed even in the palace, he finally had some clues as to why Zhao Xuanzu would kill Zhao Huangchao of Quanglu Mountain, Yuan Tingshan of Mount Huishan, eldest sister of Gangnam-do, was assassinated, the young chief Hong Shixiang went to Wudong, the Taoist master residence's Dragon Pond, the birth of Zhao Xuansu of Mount Longhu, and the disturbance in the martial emperor city. Although there were definitely many hidden secrets and schemes, the main threads were probably not far off. After Su Fingnian came back to his senses, he caught a glimpse of Murong Wuju's rosy cheeks from the corner of his eyes. She was standing by the lake and peeping at him. He thought it was funny and asked, "I heard that Wang Xianji of the martial emperor city has a tall and sturdy figure. He has big ears and round eyes, a beard like a halberd, white hair like snow, and a very fierce aura. He only wears hemp clothes during the cold and summer, but he wears a fur coat during the rainy and snowy weather. He likes to go to the East Sea to hunt jiao whales. Those who are timid would feel their liver and guts shattered just by looking at him." This question put Murong Wuju in a difficult position. She blushed and said softly, "Wuju left the city with your highness at that time. We left in a hurry and couldn't see clearly. I hope your highness can forgive me." Su Fingnian comforted her gently, "I'm just saying it casually. Don't be nervous." Other than Murong Wuju, among the three people, Pei Nanwei was very prickly. She didn't have the slightest awareness that she was a sparrow in a cage. She opposed him in almost everything. She felt that she was even more arrogant than the Princess Jing, and in Xiangfan City. However, Xu Xiu had been suppressing her recently. She finally became a little more adept at serving people. Although her expression was ugly, it was only a so-so. Emperor Murong Tonghuang's temperament was gloomy. He seemed to have a deformed addiction to power. Su Fingnian guessed that the fact that he was the hereditary king of Beiliang was far more intimidating than his own words and deeds. Su Fingnian didn't like Emperor Murong Tonghuang's shrewdness. As for Xu Xiu, she was a woman who had cultivated the ways of the world. She had been in Jianghu and the prince's mansion for a long time. She had already cut her pure and kind heart into pieces and fed it to the dogs. Since the life of this beautiful woman with boundless beauty was even more important than the flesh on her chest, Su Fingnian could hook his finger and they could have sex. However, it was unknown who would take advantage of who at that time. Su Fingnian was not that thirsty. Murong Wuju looked at His Royal Highness who was standing on the green bamboo. Her eyes were overflowing with undisguised admiration and reverence. Her feelings and thoughts were far simpler and clearer than her brother Murong Tonghuang. Su Fingnian had saved them from the abyss of suffering. Whether she saw injustice on the road or pushed the boat with the current, she firmly remembered this great kindness. Along the way from the Great Bull Gang in Jianzhou, her emotions rose and fell because of the young heir in front of her. Especially in the martial emperor city, he walked to the top of the city wall with a bowl in his hand and sat cross-legged. He was so romantic and elegant that Murong Wuju felt drunk as if she had drunk a pot of good wine. Until now, she still hadn't recovered. Outside the martial emperor city, Su Fingnian drew his saber and cut open the body of the ancestor of Mount Longhu. She was even more frightened when she saw that. She only had one thought at that time. If he unfortunately died, she didn't want to live. Murong Tonghuang glanced at his sister from the corner of his eyes. He just looked at her with cold eyes. Su Fingnian gathered his fur and was about to go down the mountain. Suddenly, he saw the bamboo door in the center of the lake slowly open. A woman whose figure could only be vaguely seen from the lakeside walked out. Even though it was vague, it still made people's hearts race. Su Fingnian had a few people around him, including Murong Tonghuang, who was also a peerless beauty, not to mention Pei Nanwei, who was a beauty in rouge. However, when the woman appeared in the field of vision, it seemed that half of her charm was taken away in an instant. The woman in the bamboo house in the center of the lake, wearing a wooden hairpin and plain clothes, walked to the mossy stone steps near the lake and squatted down. She picked up a handful of water with both hands and gently moistened her cheeks. Then, she turned her head and looked at Su Fingnian from afar. She didn't make a sound. She just quietly looked at this group of uninvited guests. She was always an orchid in a secluded valley, aloof from the world. Su Fengnian, who was wearing a brocade fox fur coat, was stunned. A trace of absent-mindedness flashed through his eyes. For the first time, he was hesitant. Pei Nanwei wrinkled her brows. She was faintly unhappy. It was not that she wanted to be jealous of this strange woman, but she had always been proud of her own beauty. She rarely met a match. The woman in the bamboo house had appeared out of nowhere. In the end, Princess Jing'an felt an instinctive sense of crisis. Sure enough, as long as there were people, there was no Jianghu. Su Fengnian let out a long breath. He waved his hand to signal Xu Xiu and the others not to make any moves. He leaped from the bamboo pole under his feet to the bamboo raft. There was no need to row the raft. The bamboo raft cut through the water and leisurely sailed toward the center of the lake. The bamboo raft stopped 3 zhang away from the bamboo house. The woman stood up and looked at Su Fengnian. Her hair was wet from the lake water and stuck to her cheeks. A few drops of water slid down her delicate snow-white skin. She reached out to wipe the water stains on her chin. She didn't say anything. Su Fengnian took the initiative to speak. He smiled and said, "I saw you 3 years ago on the banks of the Luo River. But at that time, I was squeezed into a group of young chivalrous men who wanted to express their love for you. I squeezed for a long time before I finally made a bloody path. When I finally emerged, I was tripped by someone and fell flat on my face. I guess you didn't notice me." She thought for a moment and calmly said, "I remember that at that time you were wearing thin clothes." It was an unexpected answer. Su Fengnian said self-deprecatingly, "Thin clothes. I was clearly a beggar in rags." It's a blessing of 3 lifetimes to be able to catch the attention of Mississippi. She saw that Su Fengnian wanted to say something but hesitated. She smiled and said, "My name is Qin Yu." Sure enough. There was a woman on the Rouge list who was not inferior to Nangong. She was a beauty who was on par with Bai Hu. Su Fengnian's face was gentle, humble, and shy. He softly asked, "Miss Chen lives here alone?" She smiled and nodded without any ulterior motives. Su Fengnian responded with an "oh" and gently jumped onto the shore. The next scene shocked the people on the lakeside. They saw His Royal Highness bend down and carry the bamboo girl. They jumped onto the bamboo raft and left the center of the lake. She bent her slender waist and her head was pressed against His Royal Highness' chest. Su Fengnian looked down and the two of them happened to look at each other. She undoubtedly had a pair of eyes full of spiritual energy. His Royal Highness was known to wander among the flowers for more than 20 years and had never tasted defeat. He had seen countless women and had seen all kinds of stunning beauties. But this pair of eyes was the only one that could be compared with his second sister Su Weisheng. The eyes on Bai Hu's face were too cold, just like his saber-embroidered winter-spring thunder in the past. She was incomparably heroic, not delicate and gentle. At this moment, she looked up and stared at His Royal Highness who was extremely daring. There was no shock, fear, or shyness in her eyes. There was a hint of anger hidden in the bottom of her eyes, which was enough to make ordinary lechers feel ashamed and hang themselves with their own hair. Unfortunately, she met Su Fengnian who was used to being lawless. Su Fengnian lowered his head and squinted his eyes. He smiled brightly and heroically said, "I promise to snatch one of the most beautiful women for my brother to be his wife. Sister-in-law, we will be a family in the future." The woman who had been expressionless finally showed astonishment. It was not strange that there were rich sons who snatched women on the street and bandits who kidnapped beautiful women to be their wives. But there was actually a bastard who snatched a beauty to be his sister-in-law in this world. Xu Xiu, who was experienced in the ways of the world, blinked her eyes and raised the corner of her mouth. He could even snatch a woman in such a domineering manner. He was indeed the heir of Baliang. Chapter 347. An inconspicuous carriage drove into the capital. The coachman was a young Taoist dressed in a plain Taoist robe. He was not very handsome and carried a long sword on his back. His expression was gentle and one could tell that he was a person who was easy to talk to. The city gate had 9 ridges and 10 dragons. It was a magnificent sight. There was only one passenger in the carriage. She sat in a fur coat and leaned against the back of the young Taoist. She listened to the young Taoist talk about the various wonders of the capital. She listened to him talk about how it was connected to Kunlun, how His Majesty the Emperor who oversaw the Hall of Supreme Harmony was from the south, and how the 6 palaces and 7 halls of the inner court were built according to divination. The young Taoist was not old, but the principles he spoke of were not small. He told the beautiful woman that in the end, all the cities under the heavens pursued the realm of mutual penetration between heaven and earth. The woman's face was thin and thin. She was wrapped in a mink fur coat that was not too expensive. She looked like a pretty girl from a middle-class family. The mink fur was messy and was not as beautiful as a fox fur coat. If it was the wealthy women in the capital who liked to compare themselves, they would not wear this kind of mink fur coat unless it was a Guangdong ferret. The woman listened to the young Taoist's gentle nagging and closed her eyes. There was a satisfied smile on her lips. After entering the city, she sniffed and softly said that it smelled good. The Taoist priest turned his head and saw a restaurant. Knowing that she was hungry, he immediately stopped the carriage, jumped down, and helped her walk into the restaurant. They chose a seat on the 3rd floor by the window with a wide view. She only ordered a vegetarian dish for herself and a pot of wine for the Taoist priest who accompanied her. This made the waiter, who was greatly disappointed, roll his eyes. He thought that this foreign man and woman were too unsightly. It was not easy for them to come to the capital, but they did not bring more money. The waiter regretted giving up this seat to them. The wine was served first. The Taoist priest poured 2 cups. The vegetarian dish, braised eggplant, was the restaurant's signature dish. She was attracted by this unique fragrance. She picked up a piece with her chopsticks and tasted it. She smiled and helped the Taoist put a piece into his bowl. She smiled and said, "It's delicious. The eggplant is peeled and cut horizontally into 4 pieces. The knife skills are very fine. Half a head of garlic is peeled and smashed instead of mincing it. Then, add a small fire and slowly fry it. 3 eggplants are put into the pot. When it is served, it is just right for this 6-inch small plate. The key is to let the bean paste, garlic, and eggplant taste complement each other and not overpower each other. Therefore, this eggplant is more expensive than the meat. We did not spend money in vain." The waiter was originally a little angry. After hearing the woman's explanation, his mood slightly improved. He thought that this beautiful but sickly woman could be considered an expert. The young Taoist priest tasted it and did not say anything. He only smiled and looked a little silly. The woman took a bite and put down her chopsticks. She looked out of the window and looked at the carriages. She held her cheeks and said regretfully, "According to your Taoist diet, people are born with the qi of heaven and earth. Therefore, the seasons are very important. Those dishes have to be done at the right time. I was originally a foodie and was not afraid of getting fat. This season is the best time to replenish my autumn fat. As long as I let go of my appetite, when winter comes, no matter how cold it is, I will not be afraid. It's a pity that I don't have any appetite now." Sigh. The young Taoist priest did not say anything and looked down. During this long journey with her, wherever she wanted to go, he would bring her there. No matter how far away it was, no matter how high the mountains were, he would bring her to see the scenery. He only wanted her to have fun and return. In the Old West Shu, he brought her to see the most spectacular bamboo sea in the world. In the Old West Shu, they went to see the ruins of Shilabi. Further south, he brought her to the nunnery. She asked for a lot, but it was the worst lot. In the far west, there were mountains that could reach the sky. Then, she said that she wanted to take a look at the capital. Most of the diners in the restaurant were natives of the capital, and they were the best at hearing rumors. The people under the emperor's feet had a sense of superiority, as if there was nothing in the world that they did not know. The most exciting topic at the moment was the battle between Wang Xianji and the one-armed Li Chungang in the East Sea's martial emperor city. It could be said that it was the most soul-stirring battle in the Jianghu in the past 50 years. Then, the young leader of the Wudang Mountain, surnamed Hong, came down the mountain. It was said that he had the magical ability of flying 1,000 miles with a sword. It was rumored that the Taoist priest was an immortal who was reincarnated from ancestor Lu. In an instant, it made the ancestral court of Taoism, Mount Longhu, lose its color. The most sensational thing was that the land immortal had not been on the mountain for long. He brought a woman to the borders of several fallen countries one after another. Sword after sword, he destroyed the few remaining pillars of fate in the Old West Shu and Dongyue. Later, he went west to Kunlun. Hundreds of top Qi practitioners in the world flocked there, hoping to witness the immortal's majestic spirit when he cut down the fate with one sword. Secret news quickly spread to the capital. When the Taoist slashed out with his sword, the thick pillar of fate that was as thick as a mountain was about to shatter. This made thousands of people in the world dumbfounded. They were all curious whether there was really such an immortal in the world who did not ascend. Someone in the restaurant spat, that Wudang sect leader may look young on the surface, but he's actually lived for several hundred years, at least 300 years, a full 560 years. Someone immediately doubted, doesn't that mean he's much older than the old sect leader Wang Zhongluo? Since he's so old, why did he only leave the mountain recently? If he really has supernatural powers, how could Mount Longhu be the minister of feather clothes? The person who spoke earlier slammed the table and said angrily, "This spiritual master is worthy of being called the immortal of earth." How would we mortals know what he's thinking? Countless people nodded in agreement. Indeed, that's right. I've heard that the great spiritual masters of the Taoist sects are all lowly and noble. They're determined to be simple and don't care about the false reputation of the mortal world. Hearing all the discussions, the woman who was leaning against the window turned around and looked at the young Taoist priest across the table with a mischievous look in her eyes. The young Taoist priest blushed. Outside the street, the sound of thunder and horse hooves thundered, causing the ground to shake as if there was an earthquake. Chapter 348. The diners at the tables near the windows all looked over and were shocked. It was actually the rarely seen elite imperial palace guards that were moving out, and looking at their posture, it wasn't just a few dozen cavalry. The imperial palace guards had always been the guards of the important areas of the capital, and their battle prowess could be said to be unrivaled. For a moment, the streets were heavily guarded, and there seemed to be no end to the cavalry. Not long after, they occupied the entire main road of the capital. Moreover, every single imperial palace guard had their swords drawn and bows drawn. The generals leading them were even the most powerful and influential military generals in the capital. Apart from the armored soldiers, there were also countless imperial palace guards accompanying them, as if they were facing a great enemy. Today's display was terrifyingly grand. Even the Son of Heaven might not be as grand as this when he went on an inspection tour. A few people with discerning eyes could see a trace of heavy wariness, and this made people feel even more chilled. Could it be that there was someone in the world who dared to act rashly in the capital? How many bear hearts and leopard guts did they have to eat, and how many lives did they have to be able to do this? The layman only watched the show, and only the true experts could see the knack of it. Apart from the close to 1,000 imperial palace guards and the imperial palace guards that had almost turned out in full force, there were also dozens of top-notch imperial palace Qi practitioners that held their breaths. The woman sighed and said, "Let's go back." The young Taoist nodded and asked gently, "Where do you want to go?" The woman smiled and said, to Mount Wudong, the place where we first met. If I don't go, I'm afraid my body won't be able to take it. The young Taoist asked, ride a crane out of the city? Or a carriage? The woman's childish nature came over, and she blinked and said, if we ride a carriage, will it cause trouble for you? The Taoist shook his head and said softly, it won't. The woman hesitated for a moment, and then slowly stood up. The young Taoist's face reddened, and he took the initiative to extend his hand. The woman took it. They walked out of the restaurant together, and when the Taoist with a sword on his back appeared on the street, those top-notch Qi practitioners all took a step back. Even the imperial palace guards that were known for their valiance and fearlessness didn't even dare to breathe loudly. The young Taoist gently carried the woman onto the carriage, and then turned the horse towards the city gate, ignoring the armored soldiers on the street. He held the whip in one hand and the woman's cold hand in the other, and said calmly, make way. The young Taoist said indifferently, I don't know your rules. As for your laws, no matter how great they are not as great as the sword behind my back. There was a young soldier beside the middle-aged general who spoke. He held a silver spear in his hand and was about to charge forward when the general reached out to stop him. The woman said gently, let's go. The Taoist priest's expression immediately softened. He nodded and held her hand tightly. Almost all the horses on the street knelt down in an instant. People and horses were thrown off their feet. Chaos ensued. There were no rules to speak of. On this day, Wudong's Hong Shixiang and Su Jihu left the city, no one dared to stop them. On this day, the world learned that the woman who loved to wear red was called Su Jihu. Wudong's little lotus peak. Clouds and mist swirled around. Chen Zhao, Song Jiming, and Yuxing Rui, the three most senior Taoist priests of Wudong, stood shoulder to shoulder in the distance, leaving the mountain peak to the couple. The three old men looked at each other in dismay. There was pride, regret, and regret. All sorts of feelings welled up in their hearts. Aside from the three young sect leaders Shixiang, there was only Li Yufu, an outsider, who had just joined Wudong. Yesterday, the sect leader went up the mountain and told them something. It could be said to be the most unimaginable feat in Jianghu's 500 years of history. No matter how reluctant they were, Qin Yao and the other Shixiang did not want to stop them. The young Taoist priest and the woman in red sat shoulder to shoulder at the bottom of the tortoise camel tablet. She swung her legs. She did not know what he wanted to do. She only looked at the 72 peaks in the sea of clouds and said sadly, Bull Rider, I might not be able to grow old with you. That year, when he was 14, the two of them met for the first time. After they met in Jiangnan, she knew that she would not live long. But when she rode the yellow crane, she felt that she had no more regrets in this life. He took her to travel all over the world. Seeing that he did not move, she wrinkled her nose and turned her head. She knocked on his head and asked, What, are you still foolishly waiting to find me in your next life? Are you stupid? Aren't you tired? The young Taoist priest thought about it and shook his head. Her eyes suddenly turned red. She bit her lip and asked, Are you going to wait for me? The young sect leader who rode the bull rubbed the woman's cheeks and wiped away her tears. His eyes were warm as he said, If I asked you to wait for me for 300 years, would you be willing to wait? She said without hesitation, You waited for me for 700 years. If I wait for you for 300 years, of course I can. The young Taoist priest, who had only held her hand after meeting again, gathered his courage and gently hugged her. He smiled and said, Okay. She wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, You really are a coward. He asked, Are you really not going to see the great general and his royal highness? She smiled and shook her head. No, I'm afraid they will be sad. I'm afraid they will cry. The young Taoist priest took a deep breath. When the woman snuggled in his arms, the so-called sword of Ancestor Lu that was placed horizontally on the edge of the tortoise camel tablet was unsheathed. It shot up into the sky, as if it would not stop until it reached the heavenly court. The clouds in the ninth heaven rolled down. The entire Mount Wudong was covered in purple qi. He said loudly, "I was Lu Dongxian 500 years ago. I was Qi Xuanzhen of Mount Longhu 50 years ago. Now, I am Hong Shixiang of Mount Wudong. I have cultivated for 700 years. I swear that I am willing to cultivate for another 300 years for the righteous path of heaven and earth. I only hope that heaven and earth will open a path for Su Jihu to ascend." The young Daoist priest's voice was like a great bell that resounded between heaven and earth. "I beg Su Jihu to ascend on a crane." Yellow cranes cried in unison. A red-clothed man rode a crane into heaven's gate. The young Daoist priest who was the reincarnation of Ancestor Lu sat down cross-legged. He looked at the falling sword that was destined to kill him and closed his eyes with a smile. Chen Yao and the others could not bear to watch anymore. Tears flowed down their faces. There was a rainbow behind the sword that was borne above the young Daoist priest's head. It spanned across the big and small lotus peaks and was incomparably gorgeous. 1,000 years of cultivation, only hoping to meet again. Chapter 349. His Royal Highness and his entourage made a slight turn on their way back and arrived at Guangling River. It was the 18th day of the 8th lunar month, the tide was rising. Tourists came from all over the world, it was an unprecedented grand occasion. After the spring and autumn period was settled, there was no longer the separation of national boundaries. Scholars carrying books to study and wanderers carrying swords to explore the world became more and more unimpeded. At the same time, exploring secluded places and admiring the scenery also became more and more popular. The Guangling Tide, Amei's golden Buddhist light, and Wudong's golden Buddhist light were known as the three wonders of the age. Great Yanji was the best place to watch the tidal wave. Today, there was even a Guangling Navy inspection. King Zhao Yi would personally come to watch. Guangling's rich and powerful officials and dignitaries all brought their families to watch the tidal wave. Compared to the commoners of the common people, although the former were fewer in number, they naturally occupied 70 to 80% of the best viewing spots. They set up a few tables and couches, filled them with good wine, delicious food and fruits. They also invited the famous scholars who had been on good terms with them for generations to chat and laugh together. When the tide gushed into Trumpet Bay, there would be a boat that belonged to the Guangling Navy leading the tide into the bay. Both sides of the bay stretched for 10 miles, and were filled with luxurious carriages and horses. On the great Yanji reviewing platform, the Prince of Guangling, Zhao Yi, gave an order. Then, small boats could be vaguely seen approaching the head of the tide. The beating of the drums shook the heavens, and the tide and the beating of the drums grew and multiplied together. The people could see a white line moving from east to west on the misty surface of the river. The white rainbow stretched across the river, and the head of the tide also gradually increased in height. When it reached the vicinity of the great Yanji, it could reach up to 40 feet high, covering the sky and the earth. His Royal Highness came a little late. The suitable viewing spots on the riverbank were already filled with tents or tables. When he heard the deafening cheers, he could already guess that the boat was approaching. He had to abandon the carriage and let Xu Xiao and Yang Qingfeng stay behind to watch. However, before they left, His Royal Highness smiled and reminded the two retainers that they might as well sit on the roof of the carriage to watch the scenery. Qing Niao was carrying a small jar in her hand and the scarlet cloud sword that was left behind by LV Qiantang was hanging on her waist. Su Fingnian was walking at the very front. Murong Wuzhu's delicate body was being led by him. With her personality of going with the flow, she might not have the face to call for help even if she got separated. Murong Tonghuang was on the right side. Some lechers who liked to join in the fun and take advantage of women were about to make a move but were slapped or kicked by Murong Tongwang without hesitation. Most of the lechers who suffered losses wanted to immediately take advantage of this young lady. However, when they saw Su Fingnian's embroidered fox fur coat, they immediately lost their momentum and withdrew their hands in embarrassment. They looked for other targets and picked a few soft persimmons to make a move. Anyway, in the sea of people watching the tide, there were many girls who kept quiet after being bullied. There was no need to hang themselves on a tree. Just like Pei Nanwei, Qinyu, who was abducted from the bamboo forest, wore a dense veil hat on her head. Her figure was enchanting, even surpassing the Murong siblings whose genders were hard to distinguish. However, these two great beauties who were ranked on the Rouge list followed closely behind His Royal Highness. On the right, Murong Tongwang was slapping the Murong siblings, while on the left, the maid Blue Bird was cleaning up the obstacles with her scabbard. No one was able to get close to them. The old man wearing a sheepskin fur coat was responsible for bringing up the rear, so there was nothing for him to do. Most of the time, his gaze was on the woman surnamed Qin, or more precisely, on her small waist. Even with his 100 years of experience, the old god of swords still had to admit that Su Xiaoshuo's eye for women was even more brilliant than the climb of martial arts. Even Li Chungang was unconvinced by this point. During this period of time, the old god of swords was busy admiring Pei Nanwei's buttocks, Xu Xiu's breasts, and the Murong siblings' twin lotuses on one stalk. It was a feast for the eyes, but the one he saw the most was the unfamiliar woman surnamed Qin, especially her slender and soft waist. TSK, it really made the onlookers feel horrified. The charm of a woman could be judged by her spiritual energy, her eyes, her charm, and her waist. If she walked slowly, her waist would sway too much, it would be coquettish and vulgar. However, if it was too small, it would be slightly petty. However, even though Qin Yumei was an absolute beauty, the old god of swords had a tinge of doubt in his heart. The timing and location of her appearance were too coincidental. After being abducted by Su Kei, she had been too calm. She had already exceeded the category of a lady from a respectable family. Observing her aura, this absolute beauty who exuded mystery from head to toe was not a martial artist. After all, how many old dogs like Zhao Xuanzu could exist in this world? What exactly was her backing? Old Man Li squinted his eyes. It was not easy for the group to rush out of the crowd. If they continued forward, they would reach the riverbank that was occupied by the Guangling family. There were many sturdy and stocky servants standing with their arms crossed over their chests, intimidating the common people. Some of the disciples of the great families had hired many famous guests in the Jianghu. They carried swords and sabers with them, looking strong and powerful. The two areas were clearly separated. This was very similar to how the famous scholar Chu Shuisheng of the Baogua Temple disdained to sit together with the common people. Su Fingnian was probably basking in the light of the beauty beside him. With him as the center, a circle of vacuum was formed around him. At this point, there was no need to stand on tiptoe to watch the tide. Old Man Li stood with his hands behind his back, looking at the line of tide that was as fast as thunder. His expression was bleak. Back then, he had looked down on the world with his sword and rode on the head of the tide on the Guangling River. How high-spirited he was. Now that he was old and more skilled at riding on the sword, he did not even have the slightest desire to be the tallest tree in the forest. Chapter 350. This old man, who only liked to play with his feet, did not know that after he had done this, he had attracted countless heroes of Jianghu to show off their skills on the Guangling River. There were strong men carrying cauldrons that weighed 1,000 pounds to smash the head of the tide, swordsmen rowing boats to resist the tide, and there were also powerful archers who shot arrows in succession and collided with the tide, creating thousands of ripples. Before Lu Qiantang became famous, he had practiced swordsmanship on the riverside for more than 10 years. Was it not because he admired the sword god Li Chuangong's appearance when he walked the Jianghu with his sword? Unfortunately, after Zhao Yi took over the territory of the Old West Chu, the Guangling navy was like a dragon and a tiger. There were no Jianghu people who dared to show off their skills. The Guangling navy, regardless of size or combat power, was the #1 navy in the dynasty. It was far from the embroidered pillows of the Qingzhou navy that could be compared to them. Once war broke out, they would not even be enough to fill the gaps between Guangling's teeth. Every year during the inspection, other than the great vassal King Zhao Yi who was overlooking all living beings from the top of the great Yanji, the one who stood out the most would be the Tide Runner, the symbol of the Guangling navy, who crossed the river alone on a boat. At this moment, when the people on both sides of the river looked over, the huge boat was light as a feather. A young general stood with his hand on his sword. His armor was bright, and he looked valiant and formidable, causing the hearts of countless young ladies to sway. The scholars of the south were like a forest, and it was a magnificent sight. If you went to any temple, you would see walls full of poetry and calligraphy. Even some shabby inns with holes in the wind and rain could see all kinds of undiscovered essays. Therefore, they had seen and heard too many of the literary talents of scholars of the same age. The one in front of them had not even reached the age of 20 yet, but he had been bestowed with the title of Grand Scholar. He also had a wonderful cursive script, known as one-stroke calligraphy. No matter if it was 10 words or 100 words, it was always written with one stroke without any embellishment. In terms of martial prowess, he had once defeated a grand guest of the Guangling prince's household in swordsmanship. This person's literary and martial prowess were top-notch, and he was undoubtedly the #1 talent in Guangling. Even the domineering Guangling heir was willing to become sworn brothers with him and treat him as an elder brother. When the boats sailed past, many tourists who had prepared bonfires and reed flowers threw them into the Guangling River with all their might, praying to the Guangling Dragon King. These people were all men and women from the local noble families or foreign aristocratic families. The most ordinary people could bring was a bunch of reed flowers, and most of them were some distance away from the river bank. How could they have the guts to throw it into the bonfires? If they did not have enough strength and did not throw it into the Guangling River, they would smash it into the tents of the extravagant descendants, and would be severely beaten. These were just some of the commoners who had the courage to throw the reed flowers. Before they could escape, they were caught by the fierce servants and evil slaves, thrown to the ground, and beaten. They did not dare to make a sound and could only crawl back to the crowd with bruises all over their faces. Su Fengnian was originally one of the most famous profligate sons in the dynasty. He did not find it strange and did not have the chivalrous heart to help others when he saw injustice on the road. His ears did not listen to injustice, and he only pursed his lips and walked forward quietly with his snow-white fur coat wrapped around him. In front of him were 2 piles of aristocratic families, and a few well-built servants came forward to block his path. Blue Bird used her scabbard to slap them away without a word, and they spun twice in the air before falling to the ground and fainting on the spot. Su Fengnian paid no attention to the clamor of the aristocratic families of Guangling. He walked to the riverbank and happened to see a stream passing by. He took the jar and scarlet cloud sword from Blue Bird and threw the jar containing Lu Qiantang's ashes into the river. With a toss of his sword, he hit the small jar and the ashes scattered into the water. Su Fengnian did not mourn the death of Lu Qiantang, but since he had agreed to that Donghua swordsman's dying wish, he had to fulfill it. Su Fengnian clapped his hands and squatted down. Looking at the surging tide, he said softly, "They say that if a hero doesn't die, his name will rise. No wonder you were cursing loudly before you died." Su Fengnian stood up and found that Qin Yu was looking at the back of the man on the bai and worship. With the veil covering her face, he could not see her expression, but it gave him a strange feeling. Su Fengnian glanced at the aristocratic children of Guangling who were still chattering. When they subconsciously shut up in shock, he turned to the silent woman and joked, "What's wrong? Do you have a lover?" She shook her head indifferently and said, "He once mentioned that calligraphy and swordsmanship were similar and that his views were unique." Cursive calligraphy leaves less white but more white space and more white space but more dense. The strokes open and close, gathering and dispersing. When used in swordsmanship, it is magnificent and magnificent. Why don't? Su Fengnian interrupted her ungracefully, armchair strategist, so boring. Chen Yu stopped talking and dismissed it with a laugh. Playing the lute to a cow. Although Su Fengnian was narrow-minded, he still had some self-awareness left. He said self-deprecatingly, "We are indeed not on the same path. Chen Yu, since we are already a family, why don't you tell me frankly, do you have a sweetheart?" Chen Yu asked calmly, "If you do, will you kill him?" When Su Fengnian heard the word kill coming out of the beautiful woman's mouth, which was full of killing intent, he laughed shamelessly and said, "I like your temperament. You're perfect to be my younger brother's wife." Chen Yu looked at the great Yan Ji, where there was a bloated man whose robe was almost torn apart. She sighed for no reason. Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Don't scare me. Are you related to the Prince of Guangling, Zhao Yi?" Chen Yu's expression was normal and she did not say anything. Su Fengnian put his hands into his sleeves and said softly, "Let's go back to Beiliang." Chen Yu did not move. She hesitated for a moment and said, "Someone wants me to go to the capital." "You can't stop him." Su Fengnian stopped and said with a playful look, "Who is it that opens his mouth like a toad and wants to swallow the sky and spit out the earth?" Chen Yu stared at His Royal Highness' face and did not seem to be joking at all. Su Fengnian's expression became strange. Chen Yu bent down and picked up a bunch of reed flowers on the ground and threw them into the Guangling River, saying, "When I was 3 years old, my fate was calculated by Mount Longhu and the imperial astronomer together. I was born as a laurel and entered the temple." The old man with a sheepskin fur coat who had been watching coldly said, "You are either the empress or the imperial concubine." "Oh," Su Fengnian said and did not continue.